Any expired cakes? Anything you're throwing out tonight? His voice was barely above a whisper, but the whole bakery heard it. 20 years old, in wet from the rain outside, jacket 2 sizes too big, eyes fixed on the floor like he expected someone to throw him out before he finished the sentence. He wasn't asking for much. He was asking for what nobody wanted. And that was the thing that stopped Jackson Walker cold. If it moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. A comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The bakery was called Sutter's, and it had been on the corner of Maple and 4th for 31 years. A heavy-set woman named Glenda Marsh had seen plenty walk through that door in 3 decades, passing through on their way to somewhere better. Stopping for coffee and something sweet. Teenagers on dates who couldn't afford the restaurants 2 blocks over. She'd seen sad, and she'd seen broke, and she'd seen the particular kind of quiet that settles on a person when life has been hitting them without stopping for a long time. Recognized that quiet the moment Evan Carter stepped inside. He stood just past the door, not moving forward, not retreating, just standing there with rain dripping off the hem of that oversized army green jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder that looked like it had survived things no backpack should survive. Young, that was the first thing you noticed. Too young to look this worn. His blonde hair was plastered flat against his forehead. His were pale blue, the color of shallow water, and they were locked on the glass display case with an expression that wasn't hunger exactly. Something more careful than hunger. Something more disciplined. First, Glenda was wiping down the counter when he finally spoke. He asked for the expired cakes, not a slice of something. A free coffee, not change. He asked specifically for what she was planning to discard. Things that had already been written off. Things that had already lost their value in other people's eyes. Glenda's hand stopped moving on the counter. She opened her mouth, then closed it. On her table, near the window, a man set down his coffee cup. Jackson Walker was not the kind of man you failed to notice when he walked into a room. He was 6'2", 130 pounds, a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed with any particular care, and forearms that were covered in ink from wrist to elbow, names, symbols, chapter patches, a few things that told a long story if you knew how to read it. His black leather vest over a dark flannel and shirt, and the patches on that vest said things that made certain people in certain places step aside on the sidewalk without being asked. He was 58 years old, and he had been a member of the Hells Angels for 32 of those years. On a town. In this town, people knew his name the way they knew the name of a weather pattern. You didn't necessarily understand it, but you knew enough to pay attention when it showed up. Benon Jackson had been coming to Sutter's every Thursday evening for 11 years. He liked the quiet of it just before closing. He liked that Glenda never treated him like a headline or a cautionary tale. Brought his coffee black without asking and left him alone, and that was all he ever needed from a place. Watching the kid from the moment he walked in, the kid was suspicious because the kid was careful. Jackson had spent a lifetime reading people the way other men read road maps, looking for the details that told you where someone had actually been versus where they claimed to be going. Things about this kid that didn't add up in the way that mattered. The jacket was wrong for him. Too big, too old. The kind of thing you picked up at a church donation bin because it was what was available. He wore it, wasn't careless. It was deliberate. He had the left sleeve pushed up slightly at the wrist, a small adjustment that kept it from dragging. Who had been wearing ill-fitting clothes long enough had learned to adapt without thinking about it. The backpack was positioned exactly so. Not slung loose, the way young guys usually wore them, with the weight shifted back for comfort. Forward, one strap tight across the chest, hugged close to his body. Not protecting the bag from theft, protecting whatever was inside it. And the question itself. People who wanted to take advantage asked for the most they thought they could get. Edges. They tested limits. They asked for things that hadn't been offered and acted like it was a reasonable request. This kid asked for what was already garbage. That told Jackson something. He didn't know yet exactly what it told him, but it told him enough to put down his coffee and stand up. It's the bakery in 7 steps. Glenda looked at him coming, and her expression shifted to something between relief and curiosity. Other customers in the place, a middle-aged woman with a shopping bag and an older man reading a newspaper, had both gone very still, the way people go still when they're watching something they haven't decided how to categorize yet. Jackson stopped beside the kid and didn't say anything for a moment. Evan had heard him coming. He turned slightly, just enough to see who it was, and then went very still himself. Had complicated reactions to Jackson Walker at close range. Most of them involved creating distance. Evan didn't step back. The second thing Jackson noticed about him. "What else you need?" Jackson said. His voice was low, unhurried. Not a threat and not a performance. Just a question that meant exactly what it sounded like. Evan looked at him for a moment with those pale eyes, and Jackson could see him calculating, not manipulating, calculating. Pulling on his coat, trying to figure out what the right answer was, trying to figure out whether honesty was going to cost him something here. "Fine," Evan said. "You're standing in a bakery at 9 o'clock at night, asking for food they're going to throw away," Jackson said, Balu. "Not fine." Evan's jaw tightened, not anger, pride, a specific kind of pride that Jackson had seen before in people who had been through things that should have broken them and hadn't quite managed it. "I'm not looking for charity," Evan said quietly. "I know," Jackson said. That surprised the kid. Jackson could see it land the acknowledgement, the way it cut through whatever defensive response Evan had been assembling. "Down," Jackson said. "I'm buying you dinner. You have to do that." "I know I don't." "Sit down anyway." Glenda was already moving, already reading the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been running a small business through 3 decades of complicated human moments. She disappeared into the back and came out with a plate. Not the expired cakes Evan had asked for, but a full dinner. On fresh sourdough, a bowl of soup that was still steaming, a slice of the lemon pound cake that was Sutter's Thursday special. She set it in front of Evan without ceremony and went back to wiping down the counter. Evan looked at the food. He didn't touch it immediately. It was the third thing Jackson noticed. A person who was simply hungry dove in. Who had been living rough long enough learned that accepting things from strangers had a transaction attached to it. And before you accepted, you needed to know what the transaction was. "Do you want?" Evan asked. He said it without looking up from the plate. This was even, not accusatory, just honest. "Nothing," Jackson said. "Always want something." "Some people," Jackson agreed. "One. Eat." Evan picked up the spoon, slowly, and then he ate, and Jackson watched him do it. And the way he ate told the story clearer than anything he could have said. He was careful, controlled, taking measured bites even though his hands were shaking slightly, which meant he was hungrier than he was letting on. Somebody had taught him manners somewhere, and those manners had survived whatever had happened to him between then and now. That meant something. Jackson wasn't sure what yet, but it meant something. "How long?" Jackson asked. Evan swallowed. "How long what?" So pause. 8 months, Evan said. Jackson nodded slowly. He didn't make a face. He didn't offer condolences. He just absorbed the information and sat with it. "Where were you before that?" Pause. "Longer, this time. I had an apartment," Evan said. "In Riverside, workshop space I was." He stopped. "Did it again. I was working on something." "What kind of something?" Evan looked up then for the first time, really looking at Jackson, pulling on his coat. Not the quick sideways assessment he'd done when Jackson first walked over, but actually looking at him. To read him, the trying to read way Jackson had been reading the kid. "Ride?" Evan asked. Jackson tilted his head toward the window, where his bike was parked at the curb, pulling on his coat. A 98 Dyna Wide Glide built out over the years into something that looked like it had grown rather than been assembled. And looked at the bike through the Rain Street glass, and something moved across his face. Of niced. Something Jackson couldn't quite name, but recognized as someone who sees a piece of the world they understand in the middle of circumstances where they understand nothing. "I designed a modification," Evan said slowly. For the primary drive system on V-twin engines, reduces heat generation by about 18%, improves torque response, extends overall engine life. It's not. He caught himself, seemed to hear how he sounded, and dialed it back. Complicated conceptually. The execution is what took time. Spent almost 2 years on it. Jackson was quiet for a moment. What happened to it? And there it was. The thing Jackson had been waiting for since he first saw the kid standing at the counter. Not the answer itself. He didn't know the answer yet, but the moment when whatever Evan Carter was actually carrying decided whether or not it was going to come out. Evan's hand tightened around the soup spoon. Someone took it, he said. Words were flat, factual. The way people talked about things that had moved past the point where they expected to feel them anymore, and then you heard the feeling underneath anyway. Took it how? Evan didn't answer right away. He set the spoon down on the edge of the bowl. He straightened slightly in his seat, and then something shifted. In him, Jackson saw it happen, saw the internal negotiation complete itself, and Evan reached back and unzipped the top compartment of his backpack. Not a notebook. It was a black composition notebook. The cheap book, the cheap kind you bought at any drugstore, but this one had been reinforced along the spine with electrical tape, and the edges were worn soft from handling. On the table between them, but kept his hand on it, palm flat, like he was steadying it, like he was making sure it couldn't be taken. This is the original design, Evan said. Everything, from the first con sketched through the final spec, dated, annotated. 3 of them, actually. This is number 2. Jackson looked at the notebook. He didn't reach for it. Happened to number 1. Evidence file, Evan said. At my lawyer's office. Former lawyer. He said it with a particular quality that told Jackson the lawyer had stopped buying his lawyer under circumstances that weren't friendly. 3 is somewhere else. Who took the design? Aaron's jaw moved. Victor Reynolds, he said. The name landed in the space between them and sat there. Jackson kept his face neutral, but inside, something snapped to attention. He knew that name. Not personally, not yet, but by reputation. Reynolds ran a motorcycle parts and custom-build operation out of the east side of town called Reynolds Powertrain. It's been fast over the past few years. Articles in trade publications, regional expansion, a reputation for engineering quality that had come, apparently out of nowhere, and then very suddenly out of everywhere. For me, Jackson said. Evan looked at him for a long moment. Not defensive. Genuinely asking because I asked. Stranger. Yeah, Jackson said. And I'm the one buying dinner. And you haven't walked out yet, which means part of you wants to talk. Talk. Evan was quiet. The rain hit the window in gusts. Glenda turned off the display case lights in the front, and the bakery got dimmer. Private. More the kind of atmosphere that made things easier to say. I met Victor 2.5 years ago, Evan finally said, at a trade show in Sacramento. Small thing, regional suppliers, custom builders. Prototype not working yet, just a proof of concept mock-up, and I was looking for a partner with manufacturing capability, distribution, the infrastructure to actually produce it at scale. He paused. 21 years old. I didn't know what I didn't know. Reynolds approached you? He approached me. Said he'd been watching my booth for an hour. He'd never seen a young engineer with that kind of instinct. Evan's voice was controlled, but something had crept into it, the specific bitterness of someone reciting a memory they've replayed so many times it's worn grooves into them. Meet to dinner. 3-hour dinner. Asked about everything, my background, my process, the idea came from, my development timeline looked like. He was interested in every detail, I thought. He stopped. You'd found your guy, Jackson said. Evan nodded once. He offered to bring me on as a development partner. Filed jointly when the patent was ready. 60-40 split in my favor since it was my core design. His lawyers draw up a letter of intent. Not a full contract. Pulling full contract would follow once we completed the working prototype together. Said that was standard procedure. That rushing into a binding agreement before the proof of concept was finalized was how partnerships went bad. Evan's voice was very even now. Very controlled. I spent 6 months working in his facility. Him everything. All three notebooks. My personal laptop. File. Jackson said nothing. The letter of intent disappeared, Evans said. Reynolds said he'd never seen it. I was misremembering the conversation. We'd discussed a consulting arrangement, not a partnership, and that I'd misunderstood the terms. He showed me paperwork. Paperwork I had never signed, but that had my name on it, describing me as a paid consultant with no ownership rights to any intellectual property developed during the engagement period. The soup had stopped steaming. Evan hadn't touched it since he'd started talking. The patent 6 weeks later, Evan said, under his name. Design, my calculations, my 2 years of development work, it as Victor Reynolds, sole inventor. He picked up the notebook from the table and held it in both hands, looking down at it. I tried to fight it. I hired a lawyer on contingency, a challenge with the patent office, and then Reynolds' legal team buried us. His motions, counterfilings. My lawyer ran out of patience and dropped the case. I ran out of money in month 4. I lost my workshop lease. It was my apartment a month after that. He set the notebook back down. Months later, here I am, he said, asking for expired cakes. Jackson looked at him for a long time. He'd heard a lot of stories in his life. People lie with perfect sincerity and tell the truth in ways that sounded like lies. Con artists who knew how to build sympathy and genuinely wronged people who talked themselves into bitterness that made their real story sound invented. Kid was telling the truth. Not because the story was too detailed to be fabricated, a skilled liar used detail. Because his voice broke at the right moments, a skilled liar knew when to break. It was something simpler and harder to manufacture. It's the way Evan held the notebook, the way he positioned it on the table, not showing it off, not offering it as evidence, putting it there the way you put down something you'd been carrying alone for too long, and weren't sure if Wesser to trust anyone enough to set it down at all. Can I look at that? Jackson asked. Evan hesitated for 3 full seconds. Then he slid the notebook across the table. Jackson opened it to the first page. He was not an engineer. He'd never claimed to be. He had 32 years of working on motorcycles, rebuilding engines, diagnosing mechanical failures by sound and instinct, and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent half his life with his hands inside machines. He knew what he was looking at. The drawings were precise, deceptive, not the sketches of someone who'd copied something they'd seen elsewhere, working drawings of code, but the working drawings of someone who had arrived at a solution through process. There were false starts in the margins, just out calculations to himself in small, tight handwriting that tracked the evolution of the idea from rough concept to refined solution. The dates on the pages went back almost 2.5 years. Words turned pages slowly. He stopped at a page near the middle of the notebook. The corner of the page repeated 4 times in different sizes, as Evan had apparently been working out scale, was a small symbol. Stylized gear with an asymmetric wing attached to one side, not quite like anything Jackson had seen before. Like the kind of thing a person drew while thinking. A visual shorthand. A visual shorthand. A signature the hand made without the mind particularly deciding to. Jackson's chest went tight. He knew that symbol. He'd seen it 3 weeks ago, reproduced in gleaming chrome, mounted on the wall of Reynolds' powertrain when he'd stopped in to pick up parts for the Riverside chapter's shop. He thought was a nice piece of branding at the time. Original, sharp, the kind of logo that a company paid serious design money for. He looked at Evan Carter sitting across from him, 31 years old, hands wrapped around a bowl of cold soup, months, homeless, the thing he owned in a backpack he never let out of arm's reach. And looked back down at the notebook, at the symbol Evan had drawn in the corner of the page, dated 2 years and 4 months ago. You drew this yourself, Jackson said. Yeah, it's just. Evan shrugged. I drew all the time when I was working through problems. Speed of automatic, I guess. You know what it looks like now? Evan's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes. Driven past that shop, Evan said quietly. So you've seen it. And Evan was quiet for a moment. When I saw it the first time, I pulled over, he said. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, and then I drove away. He paused. What was I going to do? I'm homeless. He's got a building and a lawyer and a brand. His voice was very quiet. Took everything I built and he made it into something. And the worst part is, he stopped. Jackson said. The worst part is it works, Evan said. Vacation, the design. It works exactly the way I knew it would. Read the reviews online. Mechanics love it. Riders love it. It does everything I built it to do. He pressed his lips together. He took it and it works. And he gets to stand there and be proud of it. Jackson closed the notebook. He slid it back across the table to Evan, who immediately placed his hand flat on top of it. Dinner, Jackson said. Evan looked at him. Not done with this conversation, Jackson said. Cold, and you haven't eaten enough, and I need to think. Eat. Evan looked down at the plate. Then he picked up the spoon again. Why does it matter to you? He asked without looking up. You don't know me. Jackson picked up his coffee cup and turned it slowly in his hands. Why, I got into motorcycles, he said. Evan didn't answer, but he listened. I was 17, Jackson said. Father wasn't around, was doing the best she could, which wasn't enough, which wasn't her fault. I was headed somewhere bad. I could feel it the same way you feel weather coming. And then a man in my neighborhood let me help him rebuild an engine. Shovelhead, 1967. He didn't have to let me near it. I didn't know anything, but he let me hand him tools, and then he started explaining what the tools were for. And then somewhere along the way, I started understanding things that made sense to me in a way nothing else had. He set the cup down. He didn't do it because he wanted anything from me. He did it because he saw something worth paying attention to, and he had the capacity to do something about it. Evan was looking at him now. I've been that man a few times in my life, Jackson said. I've had the chance, and I don't always get it right. But I recognize the situation when it's in front of me. It was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to make some calls, Jackson said. But first, where are you sleeping tonight? The question landed visibly. Evan's shoulders shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a fractional bracing. The body preparing for charity that was going to come with strings attached. I've got a spot, Evan said. A spot, Jackson repeated. It's dry. Is it heated? A pause. It was warm earlier. Jackson pulled out his phone. He made a call that lasted 45 seconds. He hung up. He said, my chapter has a property out on the east side. We've got a room there. Nothing fancy, a cot, heat, a bathroom. You can stay there tonight. Evan's jaw tightened. I'm not going to owe you something I can't pay back, he said. Owe me anything, Jackson said. People always say that. And sometimes they mean it, Jackson said. I'm one of the times they mean it. He held Evan's gaze. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to make a practical decision about whether a dry heated room is better than whatever spot you've got. All this is right now. Evan looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the lemon pound cake and took a bite. Jackson read correctly as agreement. They left Sutter's at 9:45. Glenda pressed a paper bag into Evan's hands on the way out without saying anything. It had 4 items in it, things she'd boxed up from the display case. Not the expired stock Evan had asked for, but the fresh things she'd been planning to bring home herself. She was a practical woman, and she expressed care in practical ways, and she didn't make a production of it, which was the right call. Outside, the rain had dropped to a drizzle. Evan stood on the sidewalk with the paper bag in one hand and his backpack over one shoulder, and he looked at Jackson's bike and then at Jackson. Not going to give me a helmet, are you? He said. I've got a spare in the saddlebag, Jackson said. Yes, you do. You going to tell me you don't ride? Jackson crossed Evan's face. That might have been the first thing resembling amusement he'd shown all evening. Up in a house without a lot of money, he said. Make do with what you can get. I've ridden. Then you know how to hold on. You, the training wheels version of the Hells Angels. In Phil coat. Jackson looked at him. Evan held the look for a moment and then looked away. And Jackson thought he might actually be attempting not to smile. Get on, Jackson said. Evan got on. Eased through the drizzle. And Jackson felt the kid behind him not clinging, not panicked, just present, balanced, was distributed the right way for passenger who knew what he was doing. had taught him, or he'd figured it out himself. He sat right. Jackson had been on this road 10,000 times. He knew every curve, every light, every stretch where the pavement got slick when it rained. Tonight it felt different. Somehow, not the road. Something in the air of it. Something in the fact that there was a 21-year-old kid on the back of his bike who had lost 2 years of his life's work to a gnat precisely because it was so good he couldn't resist stealing it. There was a thing Jackson believed that he'd never been able to articulate cleanly. Something about fairness, not the abstract kind, not justice as a concept, immediate, but the concrete kind. The kind where you look at a situation directly in front of you. A person with everything has taken everything from a person with nothing, and you have the capacity to do something about it. The question is whether you're willing to. Jackson was willing. He just needed to figure out how. Property was a converted warehouse 3 miles east of town. The chapter used it for storage, maintenance, occasional gatherings. Rooms that had been walled off and fitted with cots for members passing through, or situations that required a temporary place for someone to be safe. Jackson had the key. He unlocked the side door and led Evan through. Room was spare. Table. Space heater, soon down the hall. Nothing that would appear in a magazine. Everything that was needed. Evan stood in the middle of the room and looked around. He set his backpack down, carefully, not dropping it, placing it, and sat on the edge of the cot. Books, Jackson said, from the doorway. How many pages total? Evan looked up. About 300 across all 3, he said. Design specs start in Volume 2. Complete working drawings are in Volume 3. Volume 3 is where? Evan's eyes went to the backpack. Jackson looked at it. It's in there, Evan said. It's always in there. Jackson nodded slowly. Get some sleep, he said. I'm going to make some calls in the morning. Kind of calls. The kind that open doors that should have stayed open for you the first time around. Jackson paused. There's a man I want you to meet, but I need to know some things first. Powertrain, when you were there, working with him, did any of his other employees see you? Did anyone know you as his partner rather than just a consultant? Evan thought about it. There was a floor manager, he said slowly. Dennis something. Older guy, 50s. He knew. He saw me come in every day for 6 months. He used to bring me coffee sometimes. He was there the day Reynolds told me the arrangement wasn't what I'd understood it to be. Evan's voice had gone flat again. Away. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at you because he was ashamed, Jackson said. That's different from not knowing. Evan considered that. A woman in accounts, he said. She processed my consulting payments at the beginning when Reynolds was still pretending the relationship was legitimate. Her name was Patrice, I think. She would have seen the original payment categorizations. He restructured how he was classifying what I was doing. Names? I don't know Dennis's last name. Patrice was, he thought. Patrice Holloway. Jackson filed those names. Of intent, Jackson said. You said it disappeared. But you saw it, you read it. I have a copy, Evan said, and Jackson went still. You have a copy, he repeated. Reynolds had his lawyer present it. I asked for a copy to take home and review. Evan's mouth twisted. The lawyer handed it to me. I'm not sure he was supposed to. Or maybe Reynolds just assumed I'd lose it or he'd be able to dispute it effectively. A letter of intent, not a full contract. It establishes that Reynolds knew from the beginning what the nature of the agreement was supposed to be. Is it? Evan didn't say anything. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack and removed a small waterproof document sleeve, the kind hikers used to protect maps. He opened it and fanned out the contents carefully. Folded papers, each one handled with the deliberate care. First, Jackson looked at the papers from across the room about Victor Reynolds. He thought about standing in his shop with that symbol gleaming on the wall, building a business on somebody else's 2 years. He thought about Evan Carter, 21 years old, carrying 3 composition notebook through 8 months of sleeping rough because he refused to let go of the proof. Lose those Jackson said. I haven't yet, Evan said. Get some sleep. Jackson pulled the door shut behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment. Took out his phone. He had a contact in his list, a man named Marcus Callahan, president of the Riverside chapter, a man who had helped Jackson navigate complicated situations before and who had resources that Jackson didn't have access to on his own. And there was someone else, a name he hadn't thought about in a few years. Retired professor from the engineering school up in Sacramento who had done work with the chapter's legal fund in a case years back. A man named Brooks. Jackson wasn't sure about the professor yet. He'd need to know more first. But Marcus he called right now. Rang twice. Walker, Marcus said. Not a greeting, just acknowledgement. I've got something, Jackson said. Can you meet me tomorrow? A pause. What kind of something? The kind, Jackson said. A 21-year-old kid has been living on the streets for 8 months because somebody with money and lawyers took everything he built. I've seen enough tonight to think he can prove it. Pause. Longer. I'll be there at 9, Marcus said. I'm on phone. Jackson hung up the phone and stood in the converted warehouse while the rain hit the roof overhead. And where in that room, behind the closed door, a young man who had spent 8 months asking for what nobody wanted anymore was sleeping in a warm, dry place for the first time in a long time. And the symbol on the wall of Reynolds' powertrain that Jackson had admired 3 weeks ago was sitting somewhere in his memory like a key that had just been told exactly which lock it fit. Oh, the work would begin. Tonight it was enough that Evan Carter was warm. Says Callahan showed up at 8:57, which meant he'd been thinking about the call since the night before and didn't want to look like it. He was 61 years old, built like someone who had spent 4 decades doing physical work and hadn't stopped. Cropped silver hair and a face that had the particular quality of a man who had learned to keep his reactions internal long before it became useful. The president of the Riverside chapter and had been for 9 years. He didn't make decisions impulsively. He didn't show up early for things he hadn't already decided mattered. Into the warehouse and found Jackson at the folding table in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station 2 blocks over. He sat down, up one of the cups, drank, and said, nothing. He's still asleep, Jackson said. You let a stranger sleep in the property. I let a kid who'd been outside for 8 months sleep in a warm room, Jackson said. Mark turns the cup in his hands. Tell me what you've got. Since Jackson told him. The bakery. And Evan had asked. The notebooks. A letter of intent in the waterproof sleeve. Who had seen Evan working at Reynolds Powertrain 6 days a week for 6 months. And the symbol. He saved the symbol for last. Marcus's expression didn't change while Jackson talked. He had the discipline of a man who had learned that the way you responded to information in the first 30 seconds usually determined whether you got the rest of it accurately. When Jackson finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Yourself, Marcus said. At Reynolds' shop 3 weeks ago. I thought it was a logo they'd paid someone to design. And it's in the notebook. Page 47, Jackson said. Times in different sizes, dated 2 years, and 4 months ago. The design annotations around it are in the same handwriting as everything else in the notebook. Almost something that was added later. Marcus looked at his coffee cup. He said, if this kid is running some kind of angle, just be not. He's not. You've known him 12 hours. I've known men who turned out to be running angles, Jackson said. Known men for 12 minutes who I'd have put my hand in fire for. It's not about the time. He paused. The question he asked in that bakery. You know what a person asks for when they're working an angle? Something that has value. Something that hasn't been written off yet. He asked for what was already being thrown away. Being on his coat. That's not the calculation of someone who's trying to take advantage. Brooks was quiet again. Then the door at the end of the hallway opened and Evan Carter came out. Slept his clothes, which Jackson had expected. Carrying the backpack over one shoulder, which Jackson had also expected. Was flat on one side. And his eyes had the careful, contained quality of someone walking into an unfamiliar situation that required rapid assessment. At Marcus and stopped. Marcus looked back at him. Silence lasted about 4 seconds, which, in this particular hallway, felt considerably longer. "It's Marcus Callahan," Jackson said. "He runs the Riverside chapter. He's here because I asked him to be here and because I trust him." Evan looked at Marcus. "Are you the person who decides whether Jackson gets to help me or not?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. He looked at Jackson briefly and then back at Evan. "Would you ask it that way?" "Because Jackson clearly operates inside a structure," Evan said. "Looks like someone who shows up to things as a courtesy. Either you're here because he needs your approval for something, or you're here because you want to evaluate whether this situation is worth the chapter's involvement. Either way, you're the decision maker in this room. I'm asking you directly." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Down," he said. Evan sat down across from him. "Give me the notebooks," Marcus said. Evan looked at Jackson. Jackson gave him a small nod. Evan unzipped the backpack and took out 2 composition notebooks, the one from the night before, and a second one, thicker, its spine reinforced with 2 layers of electrical tape. Them both on the table, and kept his hands on them for just a moment before sliding them across. Opened the first one. Marcus opened the one. He was not an engineer either, but he was a man who had spent 40 years around machines and the people who understood them. He knew how to read the difference between someone who had worked through a problem and someone who had copied down a solution. Pages slowly. He stopped at page 47, at the symbol for a long time. "You drew this," he said. "Constantly," Evan said, "while I was working. First, it's just something my hand did. Like doodling, except I was always in the middle of calculations when I did it, so it ended up on a lot of pages. And you've seen it at Reynolds Powertrain. On the wall behind the front counter," Evan said. 18 inches across, in chrome. He had it made into a display piece. Book loads the notebook. Marcus closed the notebook across the table to Evan, who immediately placed his hand flat on top of them. "The letter of intent," Marcus said. Evan produced the waterproof sleeve, out the letter, and unfolded it carefully, and set it in front of Marcus without letting go of the edge. Read it. He read it twice. "Reynolds' lawyer handed this to you," he said. "The meeting where they presented the terms. I asked for a copy and he gave me one." Evan paused. "Think Reynolds knew he'd done it until later." "Already Reynolds figured it out. I was already gone from the facility, and he probably calculated that even if I had it, I'd never be able to do anything with it." "Did you keep it in a waterproof sleeve?" Evan looked at him. "I was living outside, and it rains." Something shifted in Marcus's face, not softening exactly. It was more like the final piece of an assessment clicking into place. He picked up his coffee cup, found it was empty, and set it back down. "The third notebook," he said. "The complete working drawings," Evan said. "Specs, primary drive modification in detail, and tolerance measurements, material specifications, see everything needed to manufacture. In the bag. Why didn't you show me that one?" "I don't know you yet," Evan said. "And the first 2 are enough to establish what happened. One is what the thing actually is. I'm not putting that on a table until I understand where we're going." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Jackson. Marcus said. "Yes," Jackson said. "That's either going to make this easier or harder, probably." Marcus leaned back. "I know someone," he said. "She works IP litigation, intellectual property, patent disputes. She's not cheap, but she's the reason 2 companies that tried to steal from craftsmen in this region ended up paying 7-figure settlements. Her name is Sandra Reeves." Evan's expression shifted. "I had a lawyer. He dropped the case when Reynolds' team started stalling." "Reeves doesn't drop cases when they start stalling," Marcus said. "She gets interested when they start stalling, because stalling means the other side knows they have a problem." He paused. "To need to see everything, every notebook, the letter, any electronic records you have, any witnesses you can name." "Manager named Dennis," Evan said, "and an accounts woman named Patrice Holloway. They both knew what I was doing there and in what capacity." "You have contact information for them?" "No, but they worked at Reynolds Powertrain as of 8 months ago. Eindable Poro, if they're willing To talk, Jackson said. Manager looked away when Reynolds dismissed me, Evans said, really pulling on his coat. He knew it was wrong. People who look away because something's wrong are not the same people who look away because they don't care. There's a difference. Marcus nodded slowly. There's also the matter of the patent itself, he said. If Reynolds filed a patent based on your design, and if your documentation predates his filing, then the challenge isn't just a civil dispute. Depending on how he got your information, how he presented it to the patent office. He committed fraud, Evans said quietly. Potentially, Marcus said, which is a different conversation with different implications. Evan was looking at the table. His hands were flat on top of the notebooks, incessant, and his shoulders were carrying a tension that Jackson recognized the tension of someone who had been holding something alone for so long that having other people acknowledge it was almost harder than the solitude. Months, Evans said. I've been telling myself I wasn't crazy, that the documents were real, that what happened was what I knew it was and not what Reynolds said it was. He looked up. Nobody believed me. Or if they did, they didn't have any reason to care. Believe you, Jackson said. You've known me 12 hours, Evans said. Same as you said. The notebooks are dated, Jackson said. Is real. The symbol on that wall is the same symbol on page 47. Need longer than 12 hours to read what's in front of me. Evan held his gaze for a moment. Then he reached into the backpack and took out the third notebook and set it on the table. Hey, he said. Marcus reached for it. He opened to the first page of technical drawings and turned it so Jackson could see. Even without the engineering background to fully interpret what he was looking at, Jackson could see the precision of it, the care. The layers of annotation. The drawings tracked the development of a solution through trial and revision and refinement. It wasn't copied. This was created. Marcus looked at it for a long time. To call Reeves today, he said finally. I'll set a meeting. Can you be in Riverside by Thursday? Looked at Jackson. He'll be there, Jackson said. Evan looked back at Marcus. I don't have money for a retainer, he said. Be clear about that up front. Reeves takes cases on contingency when she thinks she's going to win, Marcus said. That means her fee comes from the settlement. You pay nothing unless she wins for you. He paused. To tell her, I've seen the documentation myself. That should get us in the door. Why would she take your word for it? Because I've sent her 2 cases in the past 6 years, Marcus said, and both of them were exactly what I said they were. Her, unless I'm sure. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Evan said something that Jackson hadn't expected. Does the chapter get out of this? Marcus looked at him. Nothing, Marcus said. Evan looked between the two of them. I'm asking seriously. There's no version of where 2 members of the Hells Angels get involved in an IP theft case for no reason. There has to be something you want. Jackson leaned forward slightly. Explain something to you about how this works. You've clearly pulling on his coat because clearly spent 8 months surrounded by people who, when there was a transactions attached, and I understand why you're reading the situation that way. That's not what's happening here. He kept his voice even. Didn't come here this morning. Market is easy because he gets something out of it. He came here because I called him and told him a 21-year-old kid had been robbed of 2 years of his life's work and was sleeping on the street, and because Marcus is the kind of man who thinks that situation is worth his time. He paused. Same reason I bought you dinner last night. Same reason I made the call. There's no transaction. There's just a situation that's wrong and the capacity to do something about it. Edie, Evan looked at him. You're either the most unusual man I've ever met, Evan said, or I'm missing something. Probably both, Jackson said. Eat something. There's food in the bag Glenda sent. We've got time before I need to make the next call. Just opened the paper bag from Sutter's, out a muffin, and held it for a moment, eating at it. Looking, as he said. Then he said, I'll call. The next, else are you calling? Jackson had been waiting for this. Professor, he said, from the engineering school in Sacramento. His name is Daniel Brooks. He taught at UC Davis for 22 years. Retired about 3 years ago. He watched Evan's face. You know that name. The muffin stopped moving. Evan put it down on the table. It's my professor, Evan said. I know. How do you know that? You told me last night that you studied engineering, Jackson said. Because when I called Marcus mentioned a case he'd referred to Sandra Reeves 2 years ago that involved an engineering student whose work had been compromised. Honor all the details. He didn't remember the details, but he remembered the professor's name because the professor had tried to intervene and gotten nowhere. I did the math. Evan was very still. Brooks tried to help me, he said quietly. Just told him what Reynolds had done. He made calls to people at the engineering school, people in the industry. His lawyer sent the school a letter threatening defamation action if any faculty member made public statements about the dispute. He paused, stopped. He had to stop. He had other students to protect. Him, I understood. Did you understand? Jackson asked. Just quiet for a moment, he said. Not really. He's been carrying it, Jackson said. I made one call this morning early before Marcus got here. This number was in the directory. He picked up on the second ring. He let that land. Your name before I finished explaining why I was calling. Ian's jaw moved. He's been waiting for someone to call, Jackson said. He told me. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Jackson could see Evan processing at the information. It meant East Kebby, the specific complicated pain of learning that someone you'd believed had abandoned you had actually been carrying the same thing you'd been carrying, just from the other side. To meet? Evan asked. His voice was careful. It's to come to Riverside, Jackson said. He said he still has everything. The assignment you submitted in his class. Every project, every documented interaction he had with you as a student. He said he has a letter Reynolds' lawyers sent him, which he kept, which establishes that Reynolds was aware of the connection between you and Brooks and moved actively to silence him. Evan looked down at the table. That's evidence of coordinated suppression, he said slowly. That's not just patent fraud. Reeves will know what it is, Marcus said. Evan pressed his hands flat on the table. He can't. Jackson could see him working through it, the legal architecture of it, the way the pieces fit, the shape of something that had looked like an impossible wall starting to reveal the places where it could be taken apart. He silenced my professor, Evan said. Tried to, Jackson said. He sent lawyers after a university professor to keep him from talking. See, yeah, because he knew that Brooks could corroborate everything. He knew that if Brooks spoke publicly, the story became too credible to dismiss. That's how I read it, Jackson said. Evan picked up the muffin again. A bite this time, chewing slowly, and Jackson could see that something had shifted in him. The weight was still there, but the direction of it had changed. 8 months of weight pressing down, and now, this time, for the first and under it, was starting to push back. Talk to Brooks myself, Evan said. I told him you would, Jackson said. The lawyer. Before any meetings, I need to talk to him first. Understood. Evan looked at Marcus. I owe you an apology, he said. Tilted his head slightly. I was rude when I came in, Evan said. Reading you as an obstacle, because that's what people in authority have been for 8 months. That wasn't fair. Marcus was quiet for a moment. No apology needed, he said. I'd have done the same thing in your position, probably less politely. And Evan's face loosened fractionally, not a smile. Mund, adjacent to it. Marcus stood. I'll call Reeves this afternoon, he said. Keep me updated. He picked up his empty coffee cup, looked at it, and set it back down with the air of a man who felt he should have bought better coffee for this conversation. Kid, he said to Evan. Evan looked up. You held on to those notebooks for 8 months, Marcus said. Outside, in the rain, with nothing. You didn't let them go, he paused. That matters. Not just as evidence. It matters because of what it says about you. He moved toward the door. Let it go now. He left. The warehouse was quieter without him. What was left of his gas station coffee cup and found it was cold. Drank it anyway. He means that, Jackson said. I know, Evan said. You're reading him correctly now. Yeah. Evan was looking at the notebooks on the table. Manager. Dennis. He hesitated. I've been thinking about him. He wasn't a bad man. I don't think he was a bad man. He was an employee in a position where his boss did something wrong, and he had a choice about whether to get involved. And he chose not to. He paused. I'm not angry at him the way I'm angry at Reynolds. We need him to talk. He'll need a reason, Jackson said. He'll need to know it's safe, Evans said. People don't step up against their employer because it's right. Lee said they step up when they believe the cost of stepping up is lower than the cost of staying quiet. Now, staying quiet costs him nothing. What would change that calculation? Evan thought about it. If he knew the case was already strong without him, he said slowly, phone, 8 feet. If he knew it was going to move forward regardless, and that his choice was between being on the right side of something that was happening anyway, or staying on the wrong side of something that couldn't be stopped. That changes the math. Jackson looked at him. You've been thinking about this for 8 months, Jackson said. I've had a lot of time to think, Evans said. What about Patrice Holloway? In calculation, Evans said. She's accounts. She processed the payments. She would have seen the original categorization of what I was partner, not consultant. Also have been the one who processed it when Reynolds restructured the records. If she did that knowingly, she's exposed. If she did it because she was told to and didn't understand the implications, she might be looking for a way to make it right. He paused. Question is which one she is. How do we find out? Her, Evans said. And we talk to her. And we read her. He looked at Jackson. You do, right? Read people. It's what I do, Jackson said. Let's go find her, Evans said. Jackson looked at him. Had come into this warehouse 12 hours ago with nothing but a backpack and a story he can get anyone to believe. He'd slept for 8 hours and eaten a muffin, and somewhere in the process had shifted from a person being helped to a person actively working the problem. What was the difference, Jackson thought, between someone who had been defeated and someone who had been waiting? Carter had not been defeated. He'd been waiting for the right room, the right ears, the right moment when the thing he'd been carrying stopped being a burden and became a weapon. Jackson said, First Brooks. Evan nodded. Today, he asked. He's driving down from Sacramento, Jackson said. Be here by 2. Evan absorbed that. He's driving 4 hours, he said. He's been waiting a year and a half to do something useful, Jackson said. Hours is nothing. Evan picked up the muffin and finished it in silence, and Jackson watched him and thought about the thing Marcus had said on his way out the door. On to those notebooks for 8 months, living outside in the rain with nothing. Something about that Jackson kept tick too. Just the persistence of it, though that was remarkable enough. The specific quality of what Evan had held on to. Money, not connections. Not any of the practical things you'd want to have if it's trying to fight back against someone with resources. He'd held on to the record, the documentation, the proof that the thing he'd created was real and that it was his. Because he understood, on some level that had survived everything, that the truth needed a witness. That it wasn't enough to know. That knowing without documentation was just memory. And memory could be disputed. And disputed memory was how powerful men buried things. He'd known that from the beginning. A 21-year-old kid with no legal training and no resources had understood that instinctively and had acted on it and had protected those notebooks through 8 months of things that would have caused most people to let everything go. Daniel Brooks showed up at 1:53. He was 64 years old, thin, with the slightly distracted quality of academics who spent most of their mental life several layers removed from the immediate physical world. A canvas jacket and carried a leather messenger bag that was clearly not new. But a year-old Subaru that had 2 bumper stickers on the back, one for UC Davis and one that said something Jackson couldn't read from across the parking lot. He came through the side door and stopped when he saw Evan. Them looked at each other across the hallway. Stood up from the folding table. Professor Brooks, he said. Brooks's expression did something complicated and swift that Jackson read as a man absorbing a collision between guilt and relief. T7. He said the hallway and did something that surprised Jackson's. He put his hand out, first a handshake, but in a gesture that was almost a reach and almost something more He caught himself and made it a handshake after all. You look all right. I'm better than I was yesterday, Evan said. You? No, Evan said firmly. You don't. Not right now. Talk about that later. He glanced at the messenger bag. Things. Everything, Brooks said. He set the bag on the table and opened it. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, and a sealed envelope. Assignment. Every project. My faculty notes from your time in my program. Out the sealed envelope and set it apart from the others. Reynolds' lawyers sent me. Jackson picked it up. Address was a law firm in San Francisco. Wanted that was for Reeves to do, but he turned it in his hands and felt the weight of it and thought about what it meant that Victor Reynolds had spent money on San Francisco lawyers to silence a retired engineering professor at a state university in Sacramento. You didn't do that for a misunderstanding. You did that when you knew exactly what you'd taken and exactly who could prove it. He knew from the beginning, Jackson said. Brooks looked at him. Yes, he said. He knew from the very first conversation. I believe that now, in a way, I didn't allow myself to believe when it was happening. He looked at Evan. I rationalized it. I told myself that perhaps the situation was more ambiguous than it seemed, that perhaps Reynolds had genuinely convinced himself, but no. The speed at which the lawyers moved on me, the specific information they referenced, things that could only have come from conversations I'd had with colleagues about Evan's case. He had people monitoring the situation. He paused. Exactly this. He was afraid of the documentation, of the connection between Evan's work and what he filed. I've been afraid, Evan said. He should have been. Brooks agreed. Jackson set the letter back on the table. Thursday, he said. Of you. Riverside. Sandra Reeves's office. He looked at Evan. On until Thursday. Evan looked at him. At notebooks on the table. At Brooks. Because who was watching him with an expression that had the specific quality of a man who had been waiting to be useful for a very long time. On for 8 months, Evan said. Thursday is nothing. But even as he said it, Jackson saw something else cross his face, a flicker of something that wasn't confidence and wasn't fear, but was the specific vertigo of a person standing at the edge of a thing they'd been trying to reach for so long. That the reaching had become its own kind of life. The reaching was almost over, and what came next was the part he had no template for. Jackson understood that feeling. He'd felt himself more than once, more than one version of this kind of moment, the moment when the thing you'd been fighting for was finally close enough to touch. You realized that winning was going to require you to be a different kind of person than surviving had. Going to be okay, Jackson said. Evan looked at him. I know, he said. And then quieter, I just need to remember what okay feels like. Brooks put his hand on Evan's shoulder briefly and then moved it away, the gesture of a man who understood that comfort had a limit and that what Evan needed right now was not comfort, but momentum. For me, what you've got. In volume 3, Brooks said, nodding toward the notebooks. Sure, everything is in order before Thursday. This is going to go through this piece by piece, and she's going to need it airtight. Evan sat down. He opened the third notebook to the first page of technical drawings, sat across from him, and leaned forward. Of them, the young man and the professor, by a year and a half of silence and guilt and distance, started talking in the focused, technical shorthand of two people who had once understood each other deeply and were now finding their way back to that understanding. Jackson stepped back at the edge of the room and watched them and thought about Thursday and about Sandra Reeves and about Dennis, the floor manager, and Patrice Holloway and the San Francisco law firm, whose letter was sitting in a sealed envelope on that table. About Victor Reynolds on the other side of town, standing in his shop under the chrome symbol that wasn't his, selling the work of someone else's 2 years. Reynolds didn't know yet. He had no reason to know. As he was aware, Carter was a homeless kid somewhere in California with no resources, no lawyer, pull-on in his corner. Calculated correctly for 8 months. He'd calculated correctly, about to miscalculate, and Jackson was going to make sure of it. Sandra Reeves's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Riverside that had the particular quality of a place that took itself seriously without needing to announce it. Flashy lobby. No oversized firm name in gold lettering. A receptionist who knew exactly who was expected and when, and a conference room that smelled like coffee and old paper and the accumulated weight of a lot of fights that had been won in this room before they ever got to a courtroom. She was 53, medium height, with dark hair, cut short, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she pulled down and pushed back up constantly without seeming aware she was doing it. Had the focused energy of someone who ran on about 5 hours of sleep and considered that adequate. Marcus had called her the afternoon before. She'd ask 4 questions to the answers, gone, and said she'd clear Thursday morning. So Jackson learned, when they arrived, already pulled the public record on Reynolds Powertrain's patent filing. Cost. That was the first thing that told him they were in the right room. She stood at the head of the conference table and looked at the assembled group: Jackson, Evan, Brooks, and Marcus, who had driven up from Riverside that morning, and she said, without preamble, her patent was filed 18 months ago. The application lists Victor Reynolds as sole inventor. Filing date is March 14th. Mr. Carter, what date does your earliest notebook entry carry? E. Evan had both composition books on the table in front of him, closed, his hands resting on top of them. Entry, related to the primary drive modification, is October 9th. Years and 7 months ago. That's 14 months before his filing date, Reeves said. And these notebooks have been in your continuous possession since that date. Yes, they've never left your control or been photocopied by anyone else. Lent. Digitally reproduced. Evan's jaw tightened slightly. I showed them to Reynolds during our working period. He had access to them for 6 months, but the physical notebooks never left your possession during that period. Them to the facility and took them home every day, Evan said. I never left them there overnight. I knew, he paused. I knew they were important to keep. Reeves looked at him over her glasses. You knew even then. I knew something felt wrong, Evan said. Exactly what yet, but I knew. The notebooks needed to stay with me. Something on the legal pad in front of her. Me about the letter of intent. Evan took the waterproof sleeve from the backpack and removed the letter with practiced care. It across the table. Reeves picked it up and read it, and even though she'd probably read 1,000 documents like this, Jackson watched her face and saw the specific quality of attention that meant she'd found something immediately. Attorney gave you this, she said without looking up. At the conclusion of the initial partnership meeting. And Reynolds subsequently claimed no such letter existed. He claimed he had no knowledge of it. He said his attorney had given me a copy of a non-disclosure document and that I had misread its contents. Reeves set the letter down. His attorney's name is on this document, she said flatly. Finch. It says exactly what you say it says. And it was signed by Reynolds himself. She pushed her glasses up. Me not. Mr. Carter, did you ever give Reynolds any reason to believe you destroyed this letter? Evan thought about it. I told him in our last meeting that I had nothing. I said it because I didn't want him to know what I had. To him to think I was as powerless as he believed I was. The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. Leaned forward. That was either very smart or very lucky, Evan said. Reeves was already writing again. Letter from Reynolds' law firm, directed to Professor Brooks, she said, without looking up. I need that. Brooks slid the envelope across the table. Reeves opened it cleanly with a letter opener from the cup on the table and read it. Her expression didn't change, but she read it twice, which told Jackson it was significant. Just interference, she said. They claimed that any public statements made by Professor Brooks regarding the dispute would constitute defamation and interference with Reynolds Powertrain's business relationship. She set it down. It was sent 4 days after Reynolds filed the patent. In the room understood what that meant simultaneously. Jackson said it first. He filed, and then immediately moved to silence anyone who could contest it. Which means he knew the filing was contestable, Reeves said. He wasn't just protecting his business. He was anticipating a challenge from someone withstanding to mount one. She looked at Evan. I was afraid of you specifically. Evan was very still. Could have been, Jackson said. Reeves pulled her glasses off entirely and set them on the table. I'm going to tell you where we are, she said, and I need you to listen carefully, because some of this is good and some of it is going to require work, and I need you to understand both. She looked directly at Evan. The documentation is strong, substantially stronger than most of what I see at this stage of a dispute. The letter of intent, the notebooks with dated entries, predating the filing by over a year, professors, records, suppression letter. These are not nothing. These are significant. She paused, but Reynolds has resources. He has a San Francisco firm that's been on retainer since before he filed. They're going to challenge the authenticity of the notebooks. They're going to argue the dates are unreliable, that the entries could have been backdated, that the correlation between your design and his patent is coincidental. Jackson said. Explain, Reeves said. Jackson described it. The gear with the asymmetric wing. Versions on page 47 of Notebook 2. Dated. Surrounded by calculation annotations in Evan's handwriting. Display piece on the wall of Reynolds' powertrain. Reeves was quiet for a long moment. That, she said carefully, is not an engineering element. That's a personal mark. No one inventing independently arrives at the same idiosyncratic personal symbol. She looked at Evan. Can you testify about that symbol specifically? How it developed, why you drew it, what it meant to you? I've drawn it since I was a teenager, Evan said. As something I drew on my notebooks in high school. A gear because I always knew I was going to work with machines, and the wing because he stopped. Reeves asked. Not pushing, just asking. Her voice was very even, because my father used to tell me that the best machines were the ones that made heavy things light. And a wing was the oldest version of that idea, making something heavy enough to lift off the ground. He paused. Before I even understood what engineering was. By the time I was in Professor Brooks's program, it was just automatic. I didn't think about it. Brooks confirmed it quietly from across the table. He was on assignments going back to his first semester in my program. He said, 3 original documents in this bag with that symbol in the corner. Mark. Same proportion. Reeves looked at the messenger bag. I need all of those, she said. Brooks opened the bag and began laying documents on the table. And on dote. And that was when the second critical thing happened in that room, the thing that shifted the structure of everything they were trying to build. Reeves' receptionist knocked and opened the door. She said something quietly to Reeves, who looked up with an expression that Jackson couldn't read. "Excuse me for one moment," Reeves said. She stepped out, held its breath. Jackson watched the door. Had his arms crossed, and his expression was neutral in the way it got when he was working hard to keep it that way. Organizing documents with focused precision. Evan was looking at the table, turning one of the composition notebooks slowly under his hands. Jackson said quietly. Evan looked up. Ask me again in an hour, he said. Came back in. She sat down. She put her glasses back on. Woman in my reception area, she said. Her name is Patrice Holloway. She says she's been looking for Evan Carter for 6 weeks. One inside. That followed had a different quality than any of the silences that had come before it. Evan's hands went flat on the notebook. She found us, Jackson said slowly. She says she found this office through Professor Brooks's faculty contact page, Reeves said. She sent an email to the university address 3 weeks ago. The faculty mail still forwards. She looked at Brooks. Brooks looked genuinely startled. I haven't checked that address, and he stopped. I check it sporadically. I may have missed it. She's been trying to reach someone connected to Evan Carter's case, Reeves said. She says she has documents. She paused, and the pause had weight. From inside Reynolds' powertrain's account system. Evan stood up. Jackson put a hand on his arm, not stopping him, just steadying. Reeves handled the introduction, Jackson said quietly. Read the situation first. Evan sat back down. His jaw was tight, and his hands were not quite steady. Reeves nodded at Jackson, with the brief acknowledgement of a woman who understood why he'd done that and approved of it. On his coat, she went to the door and said something to the receptionist. Holloway was in her mid-40s. Patrice was in her mid-40s, neat, with the had rehearsed this moment in their head many times and was now discovering that the real version felt different from the rehearsed one. She carried a manila envelope held flat against her side, with one arm pressed against it like she was keeping it from escaping. She came in the room and looked at Evan and said immediately, "I'm sorry. You to know that," before anything else. Evan looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Each watched him work through it, the recognition. Math, the recognition. The complicated math of confronting someone who had been part of the machinery that had dismantled his life, even if she hadn't been the one who designed the machine. "Down," Evan said. His voice was measured. She sat. "Process the payments." He said, "Yes." "You saw the original classification." It was steady, but her hands weren't quite right. "When you came on, Reynolds told me you were a development partner." His words, development partner. "The initial payment structure reflected that. Provisions I set up for milestone payments, for shared revenue distribution, for," she stopped. "Months into your time there, Reynolds came to me and told me there'd been a restructuring. Now a consulting vendor. He had paperwork. He had me reclassify everything retroactively." "Did you know what that meant?" Reeves asked. Patrice looked at her. "I knew it wasn't right," she said carefully. "I didn't know the full legal implications, but I knew it wasn't what it had been. And I knew," she pressed her lips together, "I knew Evan hadn't signed anything to change the arrangement because I would have processed those signatures." "No signatures. Reynolds just told me it had changed and handed me paperwork and told me to reclassify." "And you did it," Evan said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. The Latinus of it had its own kind of weight. Patrice said, "I did. I had 2 kids in college. I had a mortgage. I was 60 days from my 5-year vesting date on the company retirement plan." She looked at Evan directly. "On excuses. They're reasons, and they're not good enough. And I've known that for a year and a half." "Changed?" Jackson asked. Patrice turned to him. "Promoted a new accounts manager 6 months ago. Someone he'd hired specifically. And he gave me a lateral transfer to a position that was functionally less than what I'd been doing. And I understood what it meant." She paused. "It meant I'd done what he needed me to do, and now he wanted me somewhere I couldn't cause problems, and he'd managed it without firing me, because he didn't want me with a grievance," she exhaled. "I understood that I wasn't a person to him. I was a tool, same as Evan was, and I started looking for a way to fix what I'd done." She set the manila envelope on the table. "These are copies," she said. "The originals are in a safety deposit box. I've had them for 4 months. I didn't know how to find Evan. I didn't know where to start." Reeves reached for the envelope. Patrice didn't stop her. Reeves opened it and looked at the contents. A long time. Ingani pulling out pages, scanning them, stacking them carefully. The room was completely quiet while she did it. Just watched her face and saw the thing he'd been watching, for the controlled, professional version of someone who has just found exactly what they needed and is being careful not to show how much it matters until they've verified it fully. She looked up. "These are the original payment records," she said, "including the preliminary partnership provisions and the reclassification documents with the dates." She looked at Patrice. The reclassification was done unilaterally, without any documentation of Carter's consent. "Yes," Patrice said. "Reynolds' legal team is going to argue these are altered," Reeves said. "I need the originals. I'll get them," Patrice said. "Today, if you need them today." "I need them this week," Reeves said. "And I need you to understand something." She looked at Patrice steadily. "You reclassified documents at an employer's direction without Carter's consent. Creates exposure for you. Depending on how Reynolds' defense shapes up, his attorneys may attempt to characterize this as your individual misconduct rather than his instruction." His face went still. "Are you saying I could be held responsible?" she said. "I'm saying you need your own counsel," Reeves said. "Separate from this case. Someone who represents your interests specifically." She paused. I can give you a referral, but I want you to go in with clear eyes about what your situation is. Absorb that. Okay, she said. Okay. She looked at Evan. It's worth, and I know it might not be worth much, I told Dennis. Manager. I told him I was doing this, that I'd found a lawyer's office connected to your case and that I was going to bring the documents. Leaned forward slightly. What did Dennis say? He said Patrice stopped. She seemed to be deciding how to characterize it. He said it was about time. Jackson and Marcus exchanged a look. Talk, Jackson said. He's been wanting to talk, Patrice said. Mina, after you were dismissed the day. Reynolds told you the arrangement wasn't what you thought. Dennis said he went home that night and couldn't eat dinner. He said it was the first time in 22 years he'd been ashamed of where he worked. She looked at Evan. He stayed because leaving meant losing his pension. He's 18 months from retirement. Evan was quiet for a moment. Want to cost him his pension, he said. Voluntarily providing truthful testimony doesn't constitute cause for termination, Reeves said. Reynolds can make his life uncomfortable. He cannot legally fire him for cooperating with a legal proceeding. Reynolds might try anyway, Evans said. Reynolds might try, Reeves agreed. Is why I want to move quickly. I want to file the challenge before Reynolds knows we're coming. He knows his first call is going to be to that San Francisco firm, and their first move is going to be damage control, which includes talking to every employee who might have relevant information. She looked around the table. I need everything in front of me within 5 days. Words, notebooks, originals of all documents, a letter from Reynolds' attorney, faculty records, versus originals from the safety deposit box. Days. Can everyone do that? A round of affirmations. Looked at Evan last. And you, she said. I need a written account. He pulling on his coat. Your recollection of every significant interaction with Reynolds, from the first conversation at the trade show through the dismissal. Dates, locations, person, who was present, what was said, what was in as much detail as you can recall. I've been writing it for 8 months, Evans said. Reeves looked at him. In another notebook, Evans said, he reached into the backpack and produced a 4th composition book, this one newer than the others, with a blue cover. He set it on the table. I started it the night I lost my apartment. I wrote down everything I could remember, every conversation, every detail. He paused. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I needed to write it before I forgot anything. Reeves looked at the blue notebook for a long moment. Then she said something Jackson hadn't expected from a woman of her professional composure. Sir Carter, she said, I've been doing this for 22 years. You to understand what you've done. She gestured at the table, the composition books, her proof sleeve, not the manila envelope from Patrice, stack of documents. People in your position, the way you were living, under the kind of pressure you were under, would have let some of this go. Have lost a document or two. They would have lost a document or two. They would have convinced themselves the fight wasn't worth it. Reasonably decided that survival was more important than documentation. She looked at him steadily. You didn't. You held on to everything, every piece of it, and because you did. We have a case that is substantially more complete than most disputes I take on with a fully funded client and 2 years of preparation. She paused. I want you to know that. Evan looked at the table. Told me once, he said quietly, that the truth needed a witness. That knowing something without being able to prove it was just memory, and memory could be disputed. He looked up. Isn't going to let it just be memory. The room was quiet. Gus said, who told you that? Evan glanced at Jackson. Jackson said nothing, but something in his chest felt the specific quality of a thing landing in exactly the right place. Worth listening to, Evan said. Reeves called the meeting to order after that, practically, efficiently assigning tasks and timelines and follow-up contacts. Patrice left with the name and number of an attorney Reeves referred her to, and the agreement that the original documents would be in Reeves's hands by Monday. Took a stack of his faculty records and promised to have the complete set organized and delivered by the same deadline. Marcus confirmed that the chapter's connection to Reeves's office would remain a background resource available if needed, not front and center, because this was Evan's fight, and it needed to look that way. Everyone else had cleared out. It was just Jackson and Evan in the conference room. Was putting the notebooks back into the backpack, one at a time. Jackson watched him do it the same deliberate care he'd seen since the bakery, each notebook handled like something that had been hard to hold on to and wasn't going to be treated carelessly just because things had changed. "How do you feel?" Jackson asked. Evan zipped the backpack. "Fied," he said. "Yeah, she's going to file, and Reynolds is going to fight back hard." "He is," Jackson said. "That's what people with money and something to hide do. They're going to try to discredit the notebooks. They're going to try to discredit me." Evan looked at him. "To dig into 8 months of my life and use it." "To try," Jackson said. "Reeves has seen that play before." "Jackson," Evan's voice was direct, "I need you to tell me honestly. Do you think this works?" Jackson held his gaze. He thought about everything he'd read in that room over the past 2 hours. Books. The letter of intent. The suppression letter. Walking in out of nowhere with documents from inside Reynolds Powertrain's own account system. Brooks, with 3 years of faculty records that showed the mark, the work, the student who had created something real. About Victor Reynolds on the other side of town, comfortable in the certainty that the kid he'd taken everything from had nothing and nobody. "I think," Jackson said, "that a man who commits fraud and then spends money silencing witnesses does it because he's afraid of exactly what just happened in that room." He paused. "He's been afraid of you for 2 years, Evan. He just didn't think he needed to be afraid anymore. That's his mistake." Evan looked at him for a moment, the backpack. "Then he showed to call Dennis," he said. "You have his number?" "Reeves's receptionist found his cell in the public employment directory while we were in there," Evan said. "She passed it to me on the way out." He showed Jackson a small piece of paper. Jackson looked at it. "You want company?" he asked. Evan said, "This one I do myself." He paused at the door. Away because he was ashamed. "I need to be the one who calls him. Not because I need him," angry at Reynolds, "but because I need him to know that I understand why he did what he did. And that understanding, it doesn't mean it didn't matter, and that the right thing still exists to be done." Jackson nodded. "Call me when you're done," he said. Evan walked out. Jackson stood in the conference room alone for a moment. He looked at the table, the ring from Reeves's coffee cup, the indentation where Brooks's files had sat, the space where the composition notebooks had been laid out for 2 hours. He thought about Thursday morning at the bakery. The question asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Eyes that wouldn't meet anyone else's. The backpack held close because of what was inside it. And then now, Reeves with a case file starting to assemble itself. With 3 years of corroborating records, Patrice Holloway, walking into a lawyer's office with evidence she'd been carrying for 4 months, looking for a way to make it right. Manager named Dennis, who'd gone home 18 months ago, unable to eat his dinner. Reynolds had calculated Evan Carter, alone and broke and discredited, couldn't fight back. Reynolds hadn't calculated was Jackson Walker, sitting in the corner of Sutter's Bakery on a rainy Thursday night, listening to a young man ask for what nobody else wanted. Reynolds definitely hadn't calculated was what happened when that young man stopped asking for leftovers and started asking for what was actually his. Jackson's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Reeves called already. She says she's filing within 10 days. She said the notebooks alone are enough to move. Jackson read the message twice. He put the phone back in his pocket. About the symbol on the wall of Reynolds Powertrain, 18 inches across. Its gleaming chrome. Reynolds had turned into a brand, a business identity, just a money, the gear with the asymmetric wing, a machine for making heavy things light. It was going to mean something very different in about 10 days. Earl's gone Carter, and this time Evan to be the one who decided what it meant. It rang 20 minutes later. Evan. Dennis will talk, Evan said. This was steady, but something under it wasn't. The vibration of a person holding themselves together by force of will. He said he's dreading this call for a year and a half. He said he's glad someone finally made it. You okay? Jackson said. Pause, he cried, Evan said. A 60-year-old man on the phone. Cried, another pause. And then I did too, for about 30 seconds. And then we both stopped and talked practically, and he told me everything he remembers, and I wrote down every word. Jackson didn't say anything for a moment. Come back to the property, he said. Words. Sleep. Reeves wants the written account by Sunday, Evan said. Tonight. You and eat at the same time, Jackson said. Back. A pause. Yeah, Evan said. Okay. Jackson hung up and stood for another moment in the empty conference room. And outside the window, the side moved in its ordinary afternoon way traffic people. Persistent, small sounds of a city that didn't know yet that something was about to change inside it. Powertrain was 3 miles east. The chrome symbol on the wall was 3 miles east. Evan Carter's 2 years were 3 miles east. Packaged inside a business that had been built entirely on what had been taken from a 21-year-old kid who had asked for it with nothing but proof. 10 days. Less if Reeves moved the way Jackson thought she would. Up his jacket from the back of the chair. More call to make before the day was done. To Marcus. Not to Reeves. To a contact he had in the trade press, a journalist who covered the motorcycle industry and who had written 18 months ago an admiring profile of Reynolds Powertrain's remarkable engineering innovation. Jackson wasn't going to say anything yet. There was nothing to say yet. But he wanted that journalist's number ready. Because when the filing happened, because when the story broke, and wanted someone in position to tell it the right way, not as a legal dispute between a company and a former contractor, but as what it actually was. A 1-year-old kid who had built something real, lost everything, slept outside for 8 months, and never let go of the proof. That was the story. And it was finally time for the story to be told. It's filed on day 8, not day 10, day 8. Because by Sunday, she had everything she needed, and she was not the kind of woman who waited when she didn't have to. Jackson got the text at 6:47 in the morning filed. Reynolds will be served by end of day. Get Carter somewhere stable. It starts now. He walked down the hallway to Evan's room and knocked twice. Evan the door immediately. He was already dressed, which meant he'd either been up for hours or hadn't slept. The notebook was open on the folding table behind him, covered in handwriting. Jackson looked at it and decided it was probably both. Filed, Jackson said. Evan stood very still for a moment. He said, Reynolds gets served today. Okay, that means his lawyers know today. And once his lawyers know, everything accelerates, Evan said. Pretty thinking through it, Jackson could see it, the sequence of it, and the chess of it. One move forced the next. To try to get ahead of it. They're going to move to have the challenge dismissed before it gains traction. To file counterclaims. Reeves knows that, Jackson said. He was already pulling on his coat. She said to tell you that's what she expects, and that she's already written the response to the motion they're going to file in the next 72 hours. Evan looked at him. She wrote the response before they filed the motion. She's seen their playbook before, Jackson said. Different case, same firm. Exactly what Robert Finch does when he's trying to protect a client who can't afford to let a case go to discovery. Something moved in Evan's face. Not quite a smile. Recognition of a person who has been outgunned for a long time, suddenly understanding that the gun they have might be bigger than they thought. I need to call Brooks, Evan said. He already knows. Called him at 6. And Patrice, same. Dennis, calling him next, Jackson said. I wanted to tell you first. He paused. How are you? Evan thought about it for a moment, which Jackson had learned meant he was going to answer honestly rather than reflexively, in a way that feels different than the other kind of scared, Evan said. 8 months, the fear was about survival. Would I eat? Would I be safe? Because I get sick. But I lose the notebooks. Survival fear. He paused. This is different. This is the fear of what if I've brought all these people into something and it doesn't work. Brooks, Patrice, Dennis, you, Marcus. If Reynolds' lawyers are better than I think, and this falls apart, and all of it was for nothing. Fall apart, Jackson said. You can't know that, Jackson agreed. But I know what Reeves said about the documentation. And I know what the letter of intent says. And I know that Reynolds' lawyers sent a suppression letter to a university professor 4 days after filing. It means they knew on day 4 that what they'd filed was fraudulent and that there were people who could prove it. He looked at Evan steadily. It's not a position of strength. That's a position of desperation dressed up in expensive suit. Exhaled. Okay, he said. Eat something, Jackson said. Glenda called this morning. She wants to see you. That surprised him. Glenda from the bakery? She heard something was happening. Town, Jackson almost smiled. She made things. Evan looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and tired, and something else underneath. Something that was still learning how to be warm again after 8 months of cold. Know how to do this, Evan said quietly. People caring. I forgot how it works. You don't have to know how it works, Jackson said. You just have to let it. They drove to Sutter's before 9. Glenda had made enough food for 8 people, which was her way of saying she was glad he was alive and she didn't know how else to say it. She said it in front of them without ceremony and went back behind the counter and didn't make a speech, which was exactly right. And Jackson drank his coffee, and the morning moved around them in its ordinary way, and for a little while, it was almost quiet. Then Jackson's phone rang. He looked at the screen. He didn't recognize local area code. He answered. Is this Jackson Walker? The voice was male, late 30s, professional, but not comfortable. Too fast. Who's asking? Jackson said. My name is David Park. I'm an associate attorney at Finch and Stour in San Francisco, calling on behalf of Victor Reynolds and Reynolds' Powertrain. A pause, the kind that was designed to carry weight. I'm calling to discuss the matter of the patent challenge filed this morning by a Sandra Reeves on behalf of an Evan Carter. Jackson looked at Evan across the table. Evan was looking back at him. In Feep, Jackson put the phone on speaker and set it on the table between them. Head, Jackson said. Mr. Walker, I'll be direct. My client has become aware that you have a connection to this situation, that you've provided resources and support to Mr. Carter. Another calculated pause. My client would like to resolve this matter quietly without the disruption of prolonged litigation. And he believes that a conversation between reasonable parties might facilitate that outcome more efficiently than the courts. Jackson said nothing. Evan said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Park felt compelled to fill it. Reynolds is prepared to discuss a settlement arrangement that would be mutually beneficial. Parties. He said the last 2 words with a specific emphasis that made it clear the offer was intended to reach Jackson as much as Evan. You're calling me, Jackson said, because you haven't been able to reach Evan's attorney. Placed a call to Ms. Reeves's office. Yes. And she hasn't called back, Jackson said, because she doesn't negotiate with opposing counsel before the case is 10 hours old. It's not how she works, and you know it. So you're calling me because you think I'm an easier conversation. He paused. I'm not. A longer pause on Park's end, Mr. Walker. I want to be clear about what prolonged litigation means for a young man like Mr. Porter. The timeline for a patent dispute can extend. I know what patent disputes look like, Jackson said. Pondered what fraud looks like. I also know what fraud looks like. And I know what a company sends a suppression letter to a university professor 4 days after filing a patent application. Because it means they knew, from day 4, that what they filed was fraudulent and that there were people who could prove it. He let that sit. A detail Reeves is going to let your client walk away from. The detail that turns this from a civil dispute into something with significantly more serious implications for your client personally. Dead silence. Have your client talk to his lawyers, Jackson said. Real lawyers, not an associate making calls he was told to make, and what they're actually facing. And then, if Reynolds wants to have a real conversation, he can have it through Reeves. He picked up the phone and ended the call. Evan was looking at him. Scared, Evan said. They called me 8 hours after she filed, Jackson said. They didn't even wait to see what the filing contained. They moved straight to finding a back channel. He set his phone on the table. You something. It tells me. May they know what's in those notebooks, Evan said. Me, Reynolds told his lawyers everything, the real story, not the version he filed, and the lawyers understood immediately how bad it was. That's how I read it, Jackson said. Evan picked up his coffee. His hands were steadier than they'd been this morning, Jackson noticed. About the phone call had settled him rather than rattled him, which was the sign of a person who was more afraid of uncertainty than of direct confrontation. Jackson's phone rang again. Reeves this time. They called you, she said when he answered. Not a question, 8 minutes ago. They called me 30 seconds after they hung up with you. Did you say to them? I mentioned the suppression letter and what it implies. Pause. Good, she said. That's exactly what I would have said. Another pause. Reynolds' lead counsel, not Park. The actual partner called me directly. They want to discuss settlement parameters. Evan leaned forward. Did you tell them? Jackson asked. Them I'd present any serious offer to my client and that my client's position would begin with full acknowledgement of inventorship, restoration of all rights, and compensation for the period of exploitation plus damages. She paused. They said that was an aggressive opening. Did you say? I said I hadn't opened yet. Jackson almost laughed. Across the table, Evan exhaled slowly, like a man releasing something he'd been holding in his lungs for a long time. Is Reynolds going to settle? Jackson asked. Reynolds wants to settle, Reeves said. The question is whether he's willing to settle at a number that reflects what actually happened, or whether he's going to fight to minimize it and force us through discovery. Discovery is where his position gets significantly worse. In discovery, we get access to his internal records, his communications with his development team, financial records showing what the modification has earned since he filed. She paused. I want to go to discovery. His lawyers know. I want to go to discovery, which is why they're talking settlement. Timeline, Jackson said. I've given them 14 days to present a written offer. That we proceed to the next stage, and the option to settle quietly expires. She paused one more time. Harder, something for me. Tell him yourself, Jackson said and handed the phone to Evan. Evan took it. He listened for about 30 seconds, his face going through several at once, the focused attention of a person receiving information. And underneath it, something more complicated. Knowns' coat, the expression of someone hearing words they'd needed to hear for long enough that hearing them now required adjustment. He said yes twice, and I understand once, and handed the phone back. Jackson put it to his ear. He got it, he said. Good, Reeves said and hung up. Jackson looked at Evan. What did she say? Evan was quiet for a moment. She said, the notebooks are the strongest piece of documentation she's seen in 22 years of IP litigation, he said, but she said that in any reasonable courtroom, the dated entries combined with the symbol evidence and the suppression letter constitute overwhelming proof of prior inventorship. He paused. And she said that Reynolds knew that. She said Reynolds has known that since the day he filed. That everything he did dismissing me, restructuring the records, silencing Brooks, relocating Patrice was the behavior of a man who knew he was holding something that didn't belong to him and was trying to make it too expensive for the rightful owner to take it back. He set his coffee cup down very carefully. She said I was never crazy, Evan said. She said what happened was exactly what I knew it was. In Fee, the bakery was quiet. Glenda was wiping down the counter again, not looking at them, giving them the space they needed without making a production of it. Jackson's didn't say anything. Sometimes, the right response to a moment was to let it be what it was without adding to it. While, Evan, I want to see it. See what? Jackson said. He looked at Jackson directly. Reynolds' powertrain, to drive past it. I need to see that symbol on the wall. I haven't let myself go near it since the first time I drove past and sat there for 20 minutes and then left. He paused. To go now, today. While the filing is active and the case is real, and I know that what's happening is actually happening. Jackson looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. They rode east. Same route Jackson had taken dozens of times, past the same intersections and the same strip malls, and the same patches of California scrub that had been there since before either of them was born. But it felt different with Evan behind him. Everything in the past week felt different in ways Jackson was still identifying. Reynolds' powertrain was a respectable-looking on a commercial stretch. Well-maintained, signage sharp. The kind of establishment that projected competence and stability. The parking lot had 8 or 9 vehicles in it. A normal Thursday morning. Business proceeding as usual. Jackson pulled to the curb across the street. They sat on the bike for a moment. Down through the front window, Jackson could see the chrome display piece on the wall behind the counter. From this distance, across the street, the shape was clear. The asymmetric wing. Evan stared at it. Jackson waited. Evan said, finally, the same thing he'd said in the bakery on the first night. I tested it 100 times in simulation before I had the resources to build a physical prototype. I knew it would work. And it does. 8% reduction in heat generation, torque response, extended engine life. He paused. I built something real. You built something real, Jackson confirmed. And he knew it was real, Evan said. That's the part I used to get stuck on, to lie in my sleeping bag and think, what if I was wrong about it? What if the design had flaws I missed and he saw them and that's why he dismissed me? And then I'd remember that he filed the patent. A business on it. That mechanics love it. His voice was very even. He didn't dismiss me because my work wasn't good enough. He dismissed me because it was. Jackson heard that and let it settle. That's the hardest kind of thing to survive, he said. Being good enough to be stolen from. Evan looked at the chrome symbol for another long moment. Said, let's go. They rode back, and the afternoon began in earnest. Dennis Marsh Jackson had learned his last name through Patrice agreed to meet with Reeves on Tuesday of the following week. Himself to Riverside. He drove himself to Riverside, which told Jackson everything about the state of his conscience. He was 59 years old, a tall man who had gone soft in the middle and had the particular bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades managing people and had recently been managing something heavier, of having seen something wrong and done nothing about it. He sat across from Reeves and gave her 3 hours. He pulling on his coat. Every detail, every conversation he'd witnessed between Reynolds and Evan. He on his coat. The day Reynolds told him to keep the shop running smoothly while he handled a personnel issue. It was the day Dennis had stood in the corridor and heard Evan being told, in Reynolds' precise and professional voice, that his understanding of their arrangement had been incorrect. And Dennis had looked away. He said that to Reeves directly. I looked away. He was a kid and he was being robbed, and I looked away. I've had to live with that. Reeves asked him to write a sworn statement. He already had one. He'd written it 6 months ago when Patrice had first told him what she was doing. He'd been carrying it in his truck ever since, waiting for someone to ask him for it. When Reeves called Jackson that evening to tell him, Jackson was quiet for a moment. A statement he wrote 6 months ago and carried in his truck, he said. The keys, waiting, Reeves confirmed. Jackson thought about Evan carrying the notebooks through 8 months of streets, carrying guilt and faculty records, Patrice carrying documents in a safety deposit box, Dennis carrying a sworn statement in his truck, all of them waiting for the moment when someone made it possible to do the right thing. He'd been the someone by being in the right bakery on the right Thursday night and paying attention to the right question asked in the wrong kind of voice. He didn't say that to Reeves. He said, how does this change our position? It substantially corroborates the times, she said. Dennis's account of witnessing the dismissal, combined with Patrice's documentation of the record reclassification, creates an evidentiary picture that is very difficult to counter. Reynolds' defense was going to hinge on the argument that Carter was a consultant who had misunderstood the nature of the relationship. Dennis' testimony directly refutes that. From inside Reynolds' own organization, she paused. Yours are going to come back with a number within the week. I'd stake my reputation on it. She was right. 9 days after the filing, on a Wednesday morning, Reynolds' legal team submitted a written settlement proposal. Evan done directly. Reeves called Evan directly. Jackson was in the room when the call came in, sitting in the warehouse with coffee, watching Evan's face while he listened. Evan's expression go through stages. First, the careful neutrality of listening, something that tightened around the eyes calculation, assessment, the mind working fast. A long pause where whatever Reeves was saying had stopped, and Evan wasn't responding immediately. Evan said. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Tell them no, Evan said. This was steady. Tell them the number is insufficient and the terms are unacceptable and that we'll see them in discovery. While Reeves spoke. I understand the timeline, Evan said. I've been patient for a year and a half. I can be patient for another few months. Another pause. Doesn't account for what the modification has earned in 18 months of production. Don't include the acknowledgement. Not a private acknowledgement, a public one. On record that this was my design. Not buried in a settlement agreement that nobody reads. I want it on record where the industry can see it. He paused. That's not negotiable. He listened for another 30 seconds. I trust your judgment on the legal strategy, he said. Do you what I need? You tell me how to get it. He listened again. Then, thank you. And he handed the phone back to Jackson. Jackson looked at him. She says we can get it, Evan said. The public acknowledgement. She says if we push through discovery and they see what's in Reynolds' internal communications, the emails, the development records, trail of everything he did to suppress this, they'll give us whatever we ask for rather than let it go to public court record. And the number? She says the number they offered today is 30% of what she thinks she can get in settlement if we hold. He paused. It's her to hold. Jackson looked at him for a long moment. It's not the kid from the bakery who had stood with his eyes on the floor, asking for expired cakes. This hoardie pulling on his coat. This was someone who had been sleeping rough for 8 months and had walked into this situation 12 days ago with nothing but proof and the endurance to have held on to it, and who was now sitting across a metaphorical table from a man with San Francisco lawyers and 18 months of fraudulent revenue and saying, not enough. I'll wait. You're sure? Jackson said. Reynolds took 2 years of my life, Evan said. It acknowledged publicly, that's the thing I need. That money can't give me. The design needs to be on record as mine. Not because of what it means legally, but because he stopped. Because of your father, Jackson said. Evan looked at him. Reeves, the wing was because of something your father said, Jackson said. Machines making heavy things light. Evan was quiet for a moment. He's been gone since I was 14, he said. He never knew about the design. He died before I understood enough engineering to even begin it. He paused. The idea started with something he said. The wing started with something he said. He looked at the backpack on the table. It on record, not for me, for I don't know. For the fact that it started somewhere before me, and that somewhere matters. He asked. Jackson said nothing. He thought about his own father, or rather about the space where a father had not been, and the man in the neighborhood with the shovel-head engine who had filled some of that space without being asked. About the things that got passed forward through other people when the direct line was broken. The ideas that traveled through unexpected channels. Hold, Jackson said. We hold, Evan confirmed. 10 days expired. Reynolds' team came back with a new number. Reeves rejected it without calling Evan. She'd been authorized to negotiate within specific parameters, and she understood exactly where the floor was. The offer came on a Friday afternoon, 22 days after the filing. Called Evan at 4 o'clock. Jax was not in the room this time. He was at the property, working on his bike in the maintenance bay when his phone rang and Evan's name was on the screen. He answered. She got it, Evan said. His voice was different. Jackson had been learning the tones of this kid's voice for 3 weeks, and he knew all of them now, the careful voice, the precise engineering voice, the controlled voice that masked something raw underneath. None of those. This was stripped down. This was someone who had run out of the ability to pretend they weren't feeling what they were feeling. For me, Jackson said, full public acknowledgement of inventorship, record with that patent office, and in a public statement to the trade press. My name on the patent as sole inventor. Reynolds removed as inventor. The patent assigned to me with licensing terms that reflect the commercial value of the 18 months of production. He paused. In the financial settlement, he stopped. Evan, I haven't had more than $40. At one time in 8 months, his voice was not quite steady. It's enough to I can rebuild the workshop. I can hire. I can develop the next thing. I can. He stopped again. I can work again. Jackson set down the wrench he was holding. It's got the acknowledgement, he said. Public. Industry press. Reynolds Powertrain is releasing a statement next week. Credit me as the originating inventor of the primary drive modification. State that the patent was filed in error and has been corrected. Ontigus Trade. The industry trade publication that ran the profile on Reynolds' innovation are being contacted to run a correction. This had gone even for a moment. The precision of a man reporting facts, because the facts were the only thing he could manage right now. 18 months from now, anyone who searches that modification, anyone who searches the technical literature, they will find my name. Jackson exhaled slowly. And, Reynolds, he said, that's between him and the patent office, Evans said. Reynolds said there may be further proceedings. That's not my fight anymore. My fight was the truth. The truth, the truth. The truth is settled. Jackson picked the wrench back up and said, set it down again, because he didn't need it and didn't know what else to do with his hands. He said, because everything else he could think of to say felt like too much or too little. Jackson. The voice on the other end of the line was quiet now. It's down in a different way. I was in that bakery 3 weeks ago, asking for food nobody wanted. I'd stopped believing that. I'd stopped that the next thing was going to be better than the last thing. I'd stopped believing that completely. I was going to that bakery because it was close to where I slept and it was raining and I thought maybe they'd have something they didn't want anymore. No, Jackson said. I didn't know you were going to be there. No. And I didn't know any of this was going to happen. A pause. Need you to understand that I understand what that means. That none of this was that you didn't have to, Evan, Jackson said. Yeah, you built something real, Jackson said. I just help people see it. A long silence. Come back to the property, Jackson said. Marcus. We'll call Brooks. Glenda will probably hear about it before we finish the phone call and show up with cake. On the other end of the line, that was not quite a laugh, but was something in the same direction. Evan said. Drive safe, Jackson said. I don't have a car. The bus, Jackson said. And Evan. Yeah, bring the notebook. A pause. I always bring the notebooks, Evan said. Jackson said. I just wanted to say it. Hung up and stood in the maintenance bay with the smell of engine oil and the sound of the town outside and the specific feeling of a thing having arrived at the place it was always supposed to arrive at, that nobody had planned and everyone had walked anyway. About Victor Reynolds and decided not to think about him anymore. It's Reeves's territory now, and the patent office's territory, and the trade press's territory. Seen pulling his coat, and the weight of it was in all those places where it belonged. See, his territory was the kid on the bus coming back across town with a backpack full of composition notebooks. Or he was what happened next. And for the first time in 3 weeks, what happened next, some things that didn't need to be fought for. It just needed to be lived. The bus ride took 40 minutes because he tracked it. Jackson knew because he tracked it without meaning to the way a person tracks something they're waiting for when the waiting has become its own kind of attention. He'd made the calls while Evan was in transit. Marcus first, who said nothing for 3 full seconds and then said good in the voice of a man who had learned to keep his reactions proportional and was working harder than usual to manage it. Brooks second, oh thank God, immediately, and without the composure he usually maintained, and then apologized for the outburst, and then said it again. Glenda he didn't call, because Marcus was right. She heard things before you called her. And when Jackson's phone buzzed 12 minutes after the Brooks call, it was a text from a number he recognized as the bakery line that said only, I'm bringing things. Don't tell him until I get there. Evan came through the side door of the warehouse at 6:14. Had the backpack on one shoulder, and he looked like a person who had been awake for a long time and was now running on something that wasn't quite energy, but was the thing that replaced energy when everything you'd been holding up finally found solid ground. Jackson was standing in the hallway. They looked at each other. Evan said, I kept thinking on the bus that I was going to wake up. Not asleep, Jackson said. I know. He exhaled. I know. It just feels like the version of this that happens in your head when you need to get through the next hour. Like a thing you tell yourself. It's real, Jackson said. Evan nodded. Slowly, like his body was catching up to information his mind had already processed. Marcus is coming, Evan asked. 20 minutes out. Driving down tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. He said he needed to sit with it tonight before he could trust himself in a room with people without embarrassing himself. And Evan's face moved at that. Something that had to do with the specific weight of being the person whose circumstances had caused a 64-year-old retired professor to need a night alone to manage his emotions. I need to tell you something, Evan said. Tell me, Jackson said. Evan set the backpack down against the wall. This one, he did it carefully, the way he always did. Probably Fullings, but there was something slight different in it tonight, not less careful. The quality of the care had changed. For the past 3 weeks, he'd held those notebooks the way a man holds something he's afraid to lose. Honestly, tonight looked like the way you set down something precious when you finally reached the place you were carrying it to. Reeves called me this afternoon, Evan said, and told me the number and the terms, and an acknowledgement. My first thought was about the design, the modification, about what it means that my name is going to be on record as the inventor. He paused. My second thought was about my father, about what he said, about the wing. Another pause. My third thought was about you. What would have happened if you hadn't been sitting in that corner of Sutter's on that specific Thursday night? There every Thursday, Jackson said. I know. But I didn't know that then. For all I knew, you being there was a 1 in 100 chance. Have been anywhere. Evan looked at him directly. And if you hadn't been there, if I'd asked Glenda for the expired cakes and nobody else was in that room or nobody else cared, I would have taken whatever she gave me and gone back to my spot, and the notebooks would still be in this backpack and would still have his name on my patent, and none of this. He stopped. There, Jackson said. You were there, Evan agreed. And I don't have a framework for what that means. I don't know how to hold that. He pressed his lips together. I've been alone for a long time. Since before the streets, honestly. Reynolds. My mother left when I was small. My father died when I was 14. I went through school on scholarships and determination, and I was too proud to let anyone see the edges. And then Reynolds, and then he made a small gesture that encompassed 8 months without naming it. And then a bakery. And then you. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Been alone a long time, he said. Not in the same way. In the way that comes from choosing a life that's hard to explain to most people. Of his family. I don't say that as a marketing line. It's actually what it is. It's also a specific kind of family. And there are things you want to give that a club isn't always the right container for. He paused. I'm 58 years old, and I was sitting in the right corner of the right bakery on the right Thursday, because that's what my Thursday evenings look like. To Sutter's, and I have coffee, and I'm alone for an hour in a way that's comfortable. And you walked in. He looked at Evan. I'm not a religious man. I have a word for what that is. But I've learned not to walk past the things that feel important. It was quiet. You didn't walk past, he said. No, Jackson said, of a vehicle in the parking lot. Then, Marcus's footsteps, Jackson knew them. The particular weight and pace of a man who moved with deliberate economy. Opened. The door. Marcus came in, took in the hallway, at Evan, looked and said, you look terrible. Incredible, Evan said. Good. Marcus crossed to him and put his hand out. Evan shook it, and then Marcus did. Something Jackson had seen him do maybe 4 times in 30 years. He kept hold of the handshake for a moment longer than necessary and put his other hand on Evan's shoulder and said quietly, You earned this. Every piece of it. Evan didn't say anything. His jaw moved. This released him. Stepped back, and his face returned to its standard configuration, the practiced neutrality of a man who had made his point and wasn't going to belabor it. Reeves called me directly, he said. The public statement goes out Monday. Trade press has been notified. 2 publications have already confirmed they're running the correction. Evan asked. Marcus named them. Evan closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. The expression of a person receiving information in a place that had been braced against it for so long that the arrival of good news required its own kind of adjustment. These are the 2 that ran the original Reynolds profile. Evan said. Marcus said. The same journalists. Reeves requested it specifically, Marcus said. That the correction, she felt strongly, should carry the same byline as the original story. Evan opened his eyes. She's thorough. She's the best, Marcus said simply. The door opened again, and Glenda came carrying a large, flat box and a paper bag that smelled like everything good that had ever come out of a bakery oven. She assessed the hallway with the quick efficiency of a woman who had run a small business for 31 years and was comfortable walking into any room and understanding it immediately. "Sit down, all of you," she said. "You look like you've been standing around waiting for permission to celebrate, and nobody's given it yet." She set the box on the folding table and opened it. Inside was a full cake, not a single slice, not leftovers, not the things she was going to throw away. Lemon pound cake, fresh, the kind that was Sutter's Thursday special, and that she clearly had made on a Wednesday because the situation called for it. She looked at Evan. "You came into my shop 3 weeks ago and asked for what I was planning to discard," she said. "I've been thinking about that every day since." She paused. "I'm glad you asked. I'm glad he was there. And I'm glad you got what was yours." Evan looked at her. "Thank you for the food that night," he said. "Bag you pressed into my hands on the way out." "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't," Glenda said. She cut the cake. "Eat." They ate. It was, Jackson thought, the most ordinary, extraordinary thing he could imagine. People in a warehouse hallway with a lemon pound cake, just eating with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel. Phil, Glenda, watching Evan, with the expression she probably wore when she watched her grandchildren open things at Christmas, eating in that careful way he had, the way that had told Jackson everything he needed to know about him on the very first night, except that tonight, the carefulness had a different quality, not the controlled eating of someone who was managing scarcity, but the deliberate savoring of someone who understood that this moment was worth being present for. For a while, Marcus said, "What's next for you?" and finished chewing. "Workshop space," he said. "I've been looking at listings online. Property in Sacramento, close to the University District, that would work for what I need. The lease with the settlement funds." He paused. "And I have the next thing. I've been working on it in my head for the last 8 months. To go when you're outside, except inside your own thinking. And I had a lot of time to think." He looked at his hands. "Refinement of the primary drive concept. Second generation. Reduction further. And addresses a limitation in the first design that I identified after Reynolds was filed, after I read the patent and realized he hadn't understood one of the subtleties of what I'd built." Jackson looked at him. "Reynolds filed a design he didn't fully understand. He understood enough to know it worked," Evan said. "On his coat, he didn't understand the underlying principle well enough to see where it could go further. I do." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to file that one yourself?" he asked. "Thing," Evan said. "Before I tell anyone. Before I show anyone. File, and then I work." He looked at Marcus steadily. "I know now. About documentation, about protection, not trusting the wrong people, with the wrong things at the wrong time." He paused. "I'm 21 years old, and I know things about how the world actually works that most people don't learn until they're 40. Wish I'd learned them differently, but I have them." Buckhead. Glenda, who had been cutting herself a second slice of cake without apparent self-conscious, said, "My late husband used to say that the most expensive education you can get is the one life gives you directly." "That's accurate," Evan said. "He also said the only way to waste it was to forget what it cost." Looked at her for a moment. "I won't forget," he said. Well, he was already pulling on his coat. The evening moved the way good evenings do when the pressure has finally been released, slowly, in the comfortable way of people who have been through something together and have arrived at the far side of it. Marcus left at 8 because he had a 6 a.m. meeting, and Marcus did not miss 6 a.m. meetings. He shook Evan's hand again at the door, and this time the handshake was just a handshake, which was Marcus's way of saying the ceremony was done and the relationship was now just a relationship. Packed up what was left of the cake, pressed the box into Evan's hands. Jackson. He needed a better coffee maker. and left with the practical efficiency of a woman who had pluses to be and had done what she came to do. On saw the two of them, and then it was just the two again the way it had been at the beginning. Evan sat at the folding table with the cake box in front of him and the backpack beside his chair, where Jackson leaned against the wall with his coffee from the gas station, the same as it always was, because Glenda was right about the coffee maker and he wasn't going to admit it. "I've been thinking about something," Evan said. "Tell me," Jackson said. "Journalist. The one you told me you had ready. Who wrote the original Reynolds profile." Jackson nodded. "Coordinated the correction directly with the publications," Evan said. "That's the official version. The correction, that's the acknowledgement, the legal record. Version that goes into the industry literature and stays there." He paused. "There's another version. The real version. The one that starts in a bakery with a kid asking for expired cakes." "It's a different story," Jackson said. "That story matters," Evan said. "For me, I don't. I'm not interested in being a profile. People, but there are people. Other people, right now, who built something real and had it taken and have nothing, and nobody, and no idea that what they're carrying might be enough. Documented might be enough. That not letting go might be enough." He looked at Jackson. "If that story is out there, maybe it does something for one of them." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "The journalist's name is Carol Demps," he said. "She's been in the trade press for 15 years. She's the one who wrote the Reynolds profile. And I know for a fact that it's been on her conscience since the correction request went in, because she called me yesterday and blinked. She called you. She heard the correction was coming. Down the connection to me. Somehow journalists do that. And she called me and said she wanted to understand what actually happened." He paused. "I told her to wait. I told her there was someone she needed to talk to first, and that when that person was ready, I'd make the introduction." Evan looked at him. "You've been one step ahead this whole time," he said. "Paying attention," Jackson said. "It's not the same thing. When can I talk to her?" "Whenever you want." Evan thought about it for a moment. "Next week," he said, "after the public statement goes out. My name is on record. I don't want the story to break before the legal facts are established. I want the record to exist first, and then the human story on top of it." He paused. "That way, nobody can dispute what happened. The truth is already official before anyone starts telling it." Jackson looked at him. "That's exactly right," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think," Evan said again, palmed. And this time there was something in it that was almost dry. It was the very pulling on his coat. Almost the very beginning of the ability to look at 8 months of impossible circumstances and find the strange dark humor in them. The resilience that comes not from forgetting what happened, but from surviving it. Early enough to see its shape from the outside. Jackson recognized that too, had recognized it in himself a long time ago, in different circumstances. "Something else," Evan said. Jackson waited. "To do something for Dennis." He said it straightforwardly, without the setup of a man asking permission. He sat in that warehouse 18 months ago and watched something wrong happen and looked away. And then he spent 18 months carrying it. And then he drove himself to Riverside and gave Reeves 3 hours and a sworn statement he'd written 6 months earlier and kept it in his truck. He paused. It's 18 months from his retirement pension. Reynolds can't legally fire him for the testimony. Reynolds can make his working life very difficult between now and that pension date. He stopped. "What do you want?" Jackson asked. "Him to know that if Reynolds retaliates and he loses that job, I'll make it right," Evan said. "Charity. As a debt. As something I owe him for not letting me disappear completely into this situation without one person inside that building knowing it was wrong." He paused. "Now, I want him to know the safety net exists." Jackson set his coffee cup down. He pieced. This was the thing he hadn't been able to name in all the weeks since the bakery, about what made Evan Carter different from the dozens of people Jackson had known who had been beaten down by things they didn't deserve. It wasn't the intelligence, though the intelligence was real. It wasn't the endurance, though that was remarkable. Was this the instinct, even in the middle of receiving what he was owed, to look around and ask who else was standing in a precarious place and what could be done about it? "I'll pass the message through Patrice," Jackson said. She's still in contact with him. He'll know within the week, Evan said. And then, with the precise practicality that was becoming familiar, and Patrice, she took a risk. She needs to know I'm not going to forget that. She knows, Jackson said. Reeves told her. I want to tell her myself. Yourself, Jackson said. Evan nodded. Her house was quiet around them. For around them, the night had fully arrived, and the sounds of the town had settled into their nighttime register, the occasional vehicle, the distant low hum of the world existing without urgency. Jackson, Evan said, yeah. Where do you go from here? It was a simple question, and it landed with a specific weight, because it wasn't really about geography, and they both knew it. Same place I always go, Jackson said. Thursdays at Sutter's. In rides. Chapter business, the work. He paused. But it's different now. How? Jackson thought about how to say it accurately. A man I respected told me once that the most important thing you can do for someone is help them see what they already are, he said. Not tell them what to be. Not build something for them. Put up the lights so they can see it themselves. He looked at Evan. I didn't build anything here. You built it. Twice, once when you designed the modification and once when you held on to the proof for 8 months in the rain. I just helped people see it. He paused. But being the person who holds up the light that does something for you too, reminds you why the light matters. Evan was quiet for a long moment. He sounds like he was worth listening to, he said. Who told you that? He was, Jackson said. He let a 17-year-old kid hand him wrenches, and he talked while he worked, and I've been carrying some of what he said for 40 years. He picked up the coffee cup and found it was empty and set it down. Works, I think. The things worth knowing travel through people. They don't stay in one place. Evan looked at the backpack beside his chair. Knowing travel through people, he said quietly, like he's setting the words inside himself where they could stay. Jackson said. The following Monday, Reynolds powertrain public statement says Reeves had promised, unambiguous. The patent for the primary drive system modification had been incorrectly filed. Originating inventor was Evan Carter. The patent was being corrected to reflect that, and the assignment transferred accordingly. Trade publications that had run the Reynolds profile ran the correction with the same bylines. Dempsey's piece was longer than a correction had any right to be. She had clearly been sitting on context for weeks, and the release of the settlement gave her the framework she needed. About the modification itself, its technical elegance, the industry reception, about the correction. She wrote a single sentence at the end that said the inventor was a 23. She'd gotten the age wrong by 2 years. But Jackson didn't think Evan would mind year-old engineer based in California who was currently establishing a new independent workshop. It was the sentence that said his name, Evan Carter, and read the piece on Jackson's phone, standing in the maintenance bay of the warehouse property on a Monday morning with the smell of engine oil and the sounds of the chapter moving around its ordinary business. He read it twice. He handed the phone back without saying anything. Then he said, she got my age wrong. Do you care? Jackson said. Evan thought about it. No, he said. What do you care about? Evan looked at the phone in Jackson's hand. My name, he said. Print. In the right place. He paused. That's what I care about. Shove it, Jackson said. The space in Sacramento came together faster than anyone expected. Evan had been researching properties for weeks. The same methodical way he did everything, instinct for documentation and preparation that had saved him applied now to construction rather than defense. He signed the lease on a Thursday, which he told Jackson felt right. He moved in the following weekend. The chapter helped not in any organized or official capacity, but in the way that things happened when Marcus mentioned offhandedly that a young engineer was moving into a new workshop and needed hands. On's men showed up Saturday morning with trucks. Evan stood in the empty workshop and watched them come in and didn't say anything for a moment. He said, you didn't have to. Oh, why no, said one of the men. A chapter member named Ray, who was approximately the size of a refrigerator and had, Jackson knew the previous week quietly, asking around. about what kind of equipment a mechanical engineering workshop needed. Do you want the workbench? Evan pointed. The workbench went there. Came that weekend too, with his own truck, with a load of university surplus equipment that he had spent the week acquiring through channels that he was vague about in the cheerful way of someone who knows they bent a rule for a good reason. An oscilloscope, 2 precision measuring instruments, a materials testing rig that had been sitting in a storage bay for 3 years. Plus, Brooks said, with the expression of a man whose definition of surplus had recently expanded. Does the university know it's surplus? Evan asked. The university is very supportive of independent engineering research conducted by its distinguished alumni, Brooks said. Especially alumni who will be credited in the acknowledgments section of what I anticipate will be multiple papers. Evan looked at him. I graduated 2 years early, and I've been homeless for 8 months. I'm not a distinguished alumnus. You will be, Brooks said. Packed the oscilloscope. The workshop took shape through that weekend and into the following week. Worked on it the same way. He worked on everything with complete focus, with the precision of someone who understood that the environment you built around your thinking mattered, that the quality of your space was reflected in the quality of your output. The notebooks on a shelf above the main workbench, not filed away. On the shelf visible, where he'd see them every time he sat down to work. Jackson visited on the Thursday of the second week, up from the town, and arrived mid-morning, and found Evan at the workbench with the blue notebook open beside him. The 4th one, the record of everything, the one he'd started, the night he lost his apartment, and a new notebook beside it. Cover fresh. That's the next one, Jackson said. Evan looked up. Yeah, he said. The 2nd generation. I've been at it for 3 weeks now. The core concept is solid. I'm in the testing phase. He paused. The efficiency gain over the first design is significant. If I can get the materials tolerances right, it's not an 18% heat reduction. The 30. It's 30%, Jackson said. It's the same principle my father described, Evan said. On the heavy thing light. The more precisely you understand why the heavy thing is heavy, the more efficiently you can address it. He paused. Design addressed the symptom. The 2nd generation addresses the root cause. To file before you show it to anyone, Jackson said. Already filed, Evan said. Provisional patent. The day I signed the lease. Gone signed the lease. He looked at Jackson with something that was entirely different from the careful, defensive eyes that had stood at the counter of Sutter's 3 weeks earlier. I'm making that mistake again. No, Jackson said. Not. He stayed for 2 hours. Made coffee. Evan made coffee from a machine that worked, which Jackson conceded was an improvement over gas station paper cups without saying so, and they sat at the workbench while Evan walked him through what he was working on. Jackson didn't understand all of it. He understood enough, understood the principle of it, the elegance of the approach, the way a problem that had seemed intractable revealed itself as solvable once you understood its actual nature rather than its apparent one. About that on the ride back. The way a problem that seemed intractable revealed itself as solvable once you understood its actual nature. He'd been applying that principle to machines for 40 years. Evan was applying it to material science and thermodynamics. He was going to apply it to whatever papers he was already writing in his head. Demps was going to apply it to the follow-up story she'd called Jackson about twice in the past 2 weeks. Earl and Dennis Marsh had applied it. In the end, to his own conscience, his conscience had understood that the actual nature of his problem was not the risk of speaking up, but the cost of staying silent, and had driven himself to Riverside and given 3 hours and a sworn statement he'd been carrying for 6 months. The town came into view as Jackson dropped off the highway onto the surface streets he'd been riding for 30 years. He passed Reynolds' power train on the way back to the property. He didn't slow down. He noted the building, the way you note a landmark on a familiar route present, registered, assigned to its correct category. Reynolds' power train, a company that had built itself on something it didn't own, and that was now in the process of being what it actually was, rather than what it had claimed to be. Lawyers were still working. The patent office was still processing. Things would take the time they took, but The name on the patent was already Evan Carter's. Already true. That was already permanent. Weeks later, Carol Demps published the full story. The correction. The real story. The bakery, the expired cakes, the waterproof in backpack. Rainy Thursday night, the in the corner, who had been going to Sutter's every Thursday for 11 years. And on that particular Thursday had been paying attention. Months. The symbol. The suppression letter. In the reception area, with her manila envelope. Dennis, and the sworn statement he'd carried in his truck. First, she got some details slightly wrong. Journalists always do. She had the number of notebooks as 3, when it was 4. First, she described the symbol as a winged cog rather than a gear. Once his coat, she placed the first call to Marcus a day earlier than it had actually happened. Small things. The large things she got exactly right. Ran with a photograph of the workshop. Just the space, the workbench, the equipment, the shelf above it, with the composition notebooks lined up where Evan had placed them. Visible, where he'd see them every time he sat down to work. Response to the piece was significant. R. Jackson heard about it from Marcus, who heard about it from Reeves, who had fielded 4 calls in 2 days from other engineers and inventors who had read the story and wanted to know if she handled cases similar to Evan's. She did. She told Jackson that if she'd had any doubt about the value of the story being told publicly, those 4 calls had removed it. Evan called Jackson the evening the piece went live. It, Evan asked. Marcus sent it to me, Jackson said. Do you think? Jackson thought about the photograph of the workshop. The notebooks. I think it's true, he said. I think, she called it. A story about what gets carried when everything else is gone, Evan said. It's her phrase for it. In the piece. Is she right? Jackson said. Yeah, Evan said. She's right. He paused again. Jackson, I have a question. Ask the man with the shovel head, Evan said. Who lets you hand him wrenches when you were 17? Did you ever tell him what it meant? Jackson was quiet for a moment. No, he said. He died before I understood it clearly enough to say it. 26, he was 72. He paused. I've thought about that. I'm telling you now, Evan said. So you know. Jackson didn't say anything. Whatever the right word is for what you did, Evan said. You now, while I can, that I know what it is. B, that I won't forget. That it's going to travel forward from here the same way it traveled to me. He paused. Knowing travel through people. I'm going to be one of the people it travels through. On Feason, Jackson stood in the maintenance bay of the warehouse property with his phone in his hand and the sounds of the chapter around him and the specific feeling of a thing being completed in a way that was also a beginning. Yeah, he said, okay. I'll see you Thursday, Evan said. Thursday, Jackson said. He hung up. Outside, the town went on in its ordinary way. On 4th Street, someone's dog barking 2 blocks over. Sound of a radio somewhere in the property. Of engine oil and California evening air. Sin looked at his phone for a moment, at Evan's name on the call screen, at the 11 years of Thursday evenings that had led to one specific Thursday of events that began with a question, asked in a voice barely above, a whisper by a young man who had learned to ask only for what nobody else wanted. He pocketed the phone. He picked up the wrench he'd set down when the call came in. And he went back to work because that was what you did. The work was where the good things happened, and because some chains of events didn't end so much as they expanded outward into the world and kept going. Eastcote, carrying their freight of truth through every person who had touched them. A design passes from mind to mind, and a wing passes from father to son. And a question asked in the right room, at the right moment, passes through every silence it breaks on its way toward becoming something the world cannot unhear. Evan Carter had walked into a bakery with nothing but proof and the refusal to let go of it. Out of it with everything that was always his.